She cooked for them. She cleaned for them. She gave up her bedroom on holidays so they'd be comfortable. And one Tuesday afternoon, standing in her own hallway, she heard her son say to his wife, "She can't last much longer. The condo will be ours soon enough." 65 years old, a widow, a mother who had given everything. And in that moment, something inside Evelyn Carter didn't break, it ignited. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people you loved most, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit like, and don't you dare look away. Yup. I want to tell you something I've never said out loud before. There was a period in my life, not so long ago, though it feels like it belongs to a different woman entirely, when I would wake up every single morning and lie still in the dark for a few minutes before I opened my eyes. Not because I was tired, not because I was savoring some beautiful dream, but because the moment I opened my eyes, I had to remember again who I was, or rather, who I had become. A widow, 65. Living alone in a condo that had once smelled like coffee and her husband's aftershave, and the particular warmth of a home where two people love each other after 31 years. Now it just smelled like quiet. My name is Evelyn Carter, and this is the story of how I almost let the people I loved most erase me completely, and what happened when I finally decided I was done disappearing. Let me take you back to October, not this past October, the one before it. The leaves were turning outside my window, that particular auburn and gold that always made me feel something bittersweet. And I was in my kitchen making a pot of soup, chicken and vegetable, nothing fancy. I'd made it 1,000 times. It was the kind of recipe that lives in your hands, not your head. Slice the celery, dice the carrots, add the broth, turn down the heat, waiting. That was something I had gotten very good at by then. I was waiting for my son to call. Marcus, my only child, this tall, dark-haired man who had somehow become a stranger in a suit. He was 41 years old and looked most days like he was already bored with everything in front of him. I don't know when that happened. I remember a boy who used to drag me outside in the rain just to jump in puddles. I remember a teenager who actually cried, when we had to put our old dog, Chester, to sleep. I remember a 22-year-old who sat beside my hospital bed and held my hand when I had my gallbladder surgery and told me, "Mom, you can't leave. You're the only person in this world who actually knows me." That boy was gone now. I didn't know exactly when he'd left. I only knew I missed him. His wife, Lena, they'd been married for 9 years, was a different matter entirely. Lena was the kind of woman who made you feel, in very subtle ways, that she was doing you a favor by being in the same room as you. She was pretty in a sharp, calculated way. She wore clothes that cost more than my monthly electric bill, and spoke with a particular brand of politeness that somehow always managed to carry an undertone of contempt. She called me Evelyn, never Mom, never even Mrs. Carter. Just Evelyn, like I was a co-worker she barely tolerated. I had tried in the early years to build something with her. I brought her flowers when they moved into their first apartment. I babysat their dog for 2 weeks when they went to Cancun for their honeymoon. I remembered her birthday, her preferences, the things she'd mentioned once in passing that I quietly filed away. She liked lavender soap. She hated mushrooms. She'd always wanted to visit Portugal. None of it mattered. To Lena, I was background noise, something to be managed. And slowly, without fully realizing it was happening, I had let myself become exactly that. My husband Richard died 4 years ago, heart attack. Sudden, the way those things tend to be. No warning, no drawn out goodbye, just here one day and gone the next, the way a candle goes out in a strong wind. We'd had plans, retirement plans, travel plans, the kind of quiet, ordinary plans that feel permanent when you make them and devastating when you lose them. We were going to drive Route 66. We talked about it for 20 years and never done it. After he died, I fell into a fog. Not dramatic, Not the kind you see in movies, where someone is sitting in a dark room weeping while rain slides down the windows. It was more ordinary than that, more numbing. I woke up, I made coffee, I watched too much television, I went to bed, I forgot to eat sometimes, I forgot to open the mail, I forgot for entire weeks to call anyone at all. Marcus came by in those early months. He and Lena would come for dinner on Sundays or occasionally take me out. And there was a version of those visits that felt genuine, or at least like an honest attempt at it. Marcus would ask about the condo, whether anything needed fixing, whether I was managing okay. He'd sit on the couch where Richard used to sit, and sometimes I'd catch him looking around the room with an expression I couldn't quite name. Now I think I can name it. He was calculating, but I didn't see that then. Then I was just grateful. Grateful to have my son. Grateful that someone was checking in. Grateful not to eat alone on Sunday evenings. Gratitude is a beautiful thing, but I had turned it into something else. I had turned it into smallness, into apologizing for taking up space, into shrinking myself down so I wouldn't be an inconvenience, so they'd keep coming back, so I wouldn't have to sit in that quiet condo completely alone with nothing but the ghost of my husband and the faint smell of his aftershave that I kept pretending I could still detect on his pillow. That's a terrible thing to admit, but it's true. By the time that October came around, I had been alone for 4 years and invisible for at least 2 of them. The visits had gotten shorter, more perfunctory. Marcus would come by, eat whatever I'd cooked, check his phone 4 or 5 times during dinner, and leave within 90 minutes. Lena sometimes didn't come at all. She had plans, she had a work event, she had a headache. The excuses arrived already polished, already rehearsed, and I accepted every single one of them without complaint, because what was the alternative? To say, I know you don't want to be here, to say, I see what's happening? I didn't have the courage for that, not yet. So instead I set the table with the good dishes and cooked things I knew Marcus liked, and listened to him talk about his work. Something in finance, something that always sounded vaguely important and that I never fully understood. And I nodded at the right moments, and I laughed at the right moments, and at the end of the evening I hugged him at the door and told him I loved him and watched his car pull out of the parking lot. And then I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table alone, and I felt it. That specific, particular ache of being in a relationship with someone who is physically present and emotionally miles away. It's not as dramatic as abandonment. It's quieter and colder and in many ways worse. I called it loneliness. But what it actually was, I would only understand later. It was grief. I was grieving my son while he was still alive. The first time I felt something close to alarm, not offense, not hurt, but genuine alarm, was a Sunday in late October. Marcus had come alone that day. No Lena, no explanation for her absence beyond a brief, "She sends her love." He was distracted from the moment he walked in, looking around the condo with that half frown he got when something was bothering him. He accepted a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started asking me questions. At first they seemed normal enough. How's the furnace running? Any issues this winter? When was the last time you had the pipes checked? Do you know what you paid for this place when you and Dad bought it? I answered each one honestly, thinking he was just being practical. Richard had been the one who handled all of that, the maintenance, the paperwork, the insurance, and after he died, Marcus had stepped in to help me manage things. It made sense that he'd stay on top of it. I was grateful even, but then, have you given any thought to what happens to the condo long term? I looked at him across my kitchen table. He was stirring his coffee, not meeting my eyes. Long term, I repeated. Yeah, I mean, it's a significant asset, and things like estate planning, you want to get ahead of it, get everything sorted out before. He paused. Before it becomes complicated. Before what becomes complicated? Before I get too old to handle it myself, before I die? I almost asked him directly. Almost. But instead I said quietly, I haven't really thought about it, Marcus. You should, he said. he said, and then he smiled, the same smile he'd had as a boy, the one that used to mean he was proud of himself for something, and said, "Lena and I can help you figure it all out. Take the pressure off." I told him I appreciated it. He left 40 minutes later, after barely touching his coffee. I stood at my window and watched his car and thought that was strange. And then I thought, he's just being practical. And then I went back to the kitchen and washed the cups and told myself I was being paranoid. I was wrong. November came and brought with it a different version of Marcus, one I hadn't seen before, or one I hadn't allowed myself to see. He and Lena came together that time, which was unusual, and they were different from the moment they walked in. Not warmer, more deliberate. Lena had brought wine, a bottle of something expensive looking, which she handed to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "We thought we'd make an evening of it." Something in my chest went taut, a kind of low-frequency warning, the kind your body picks up before your mind catches on. We sat in the living room. Lena looked around with the slow, appraising look of someone cataloguing furniture. She ran a hand along the arm of my sofa. Richard's sofa, the dark blue one he'd sat in every evening for 15 years, and said, almost to herself, "This is a really lovely space." "Thank you," I said. "The light in here is incredible." She gestured toward the windows. "South-facing?" "Southeast." She nodded like I'd confirmed something she'd already known. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mom, we've actually been wanting to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay. The thing is, and we want to be sensitive about this because we know it's a hard topic, but with Dad gone and you being here by yourself, we've been thinking about what makes the most sense going forward." I kept my voice neutral. "What do you mean?" Lena leaned forward. She had the particular manner of someone who has rehearsed a speech and is delivering it while pretending she hasn't. "We've been looking at some options for you. There are some really beautiful assisted living communities in the area. Very high quality, very social. I think you'd actually love it. You'd have neighbors, activities, staff available if you needed anything. Assisted living. I was 65, I was healthy, I drove myself to the grocery store. I took a yoga class on Wednesday mornings. My doctor had told me 6 months ago that my blood work was excellent for my age. I don't need assisted living, I said. "Not now," Marcus said quickly, "but it's something to think about ahead of time. Get on the wait list early. That way, whenever it makes sense to transition, you're not scrambling." Whenever it makes sense to transition. Whenever. "And in the meantime," Lena added, her voice careful and gentle in that maddening way, "it might be worth considering what to do with this space. It's a lot for one person. And property values in this area have really increased. If you were to sell now, you'd walk away with a really significant amount." There it was. I sat very still for a moment. The wine she'd brought was open on the coffee table, and I hadn't touched my glass. "So you think I should sell the condo?" I said slowly. "We're just saying it's worth considering," Marcus began, "and move into assisted living. It would free up the capital." "And then what?" I asked. "What happens to the money from the condo?" They exchanged a look. Quick, a half-second flicker, but I saw it. "That would obviously be entirely your decision," Lena said. "But if you wanted to, if it would give you peace of mind to know your family was taken care of." "Lena," my voice came out flat, "are you suggesting I give you the money from my home?" A tiny pause. "We're suggesting you consider your options," she said smoothly, and that's all. I picked up my wine glass then, took a sip, put it back down. "I'll think about it, I said. They seemed satisfied with that. We ate dinner and the conversation moved on, and they left at 9 o'clock with warm goodbyes and the promise to talk more soon. And I locked the door behind them and pressed my back against it for a long moment, staring at my living room ceiling. I didn't sleep that night, not a single hour. After that, I started paying attention differently. It's a strange thing to look back at years of your life and realize you'd had your eyes partly closed. Not because you were stupid, but because seeing certain things clearly would have meant feeling them clearly. And some truths are so painful that your own mind constructs gentle barriers between you and them. My barrier had been this: they love me, they're busy, they have their own lives. I have to be grateful for what they give. Now I let the barrier come down. I started noticing the things I'd always technically observed but never fully registered. The way Lena's eyes moved around my condo when she thought I wasn't looking. Not with affection, but with something more like inventory. The way Marcus would pause in the hallway by the framed photographs and look at them with that same unreadable expression. The way they never ever asked how I was doing, really doing, but always circled back to the condo, its value, its size, its potential. I noticed the way Marcus cut me off sometimes mid-sentence, not rudely, just smoothly, efficiently, the way you cut short a conversation that doesn't interest you. I noticed that Lena, in 9 years of marriage to my son, had never once called me to chat, never once sent me a card for my birthday that wasn't perfunctory, never once asked me a single question about my life before Marcus. To her, I had no life before Marcus. I was simply a woman who owned a condo and was eventually going to stop being a problem. These were not new facts. They had all been there in plain sight for years, but I had looked past them, because looking at them meant accepting something that broke my heart. My son was not looking out for me. My son was looking at what I had. December came slowly, and it was cold that year, the kind of cold that gets inside you and stays. I turned up the heat more than usual and spent more time than I should have sitting by the window watching the street below, watching strangers go about their lives, wondering what it would feel like to not be invisible inside your own existence. I was doing exactly that on a Thursday afternoon in early December when Marcus called. "Hey Mom," casual, easy. The voice he used when he wanted something. Marcus. "So Lena and I have been talking." "You're always talking," I said, and immediately regretted it. Old habit. Smooth the edges. Don't make him uncomfortable. A slight pause. "Right. Well, we've been talking about the holidays and we thought it might be nice to have Christmas here this year at our place." "That would be lovely," I said. "Great. And listen, since you'll be coming to us, you don't have to worry about hosting, obviously. So we were thinking this might actually be a good time for you to maybe start thinking about the condo situation. Like it could be a fresh start for the new year. Talk to a real estate agent, get a sense of what you're working with." "Marcus," I said, "and then we can sit down together and map out a plan." "Marcus." He stopped. "I heard you," I said. "I'll think about it." He thanked me, said he loved me, hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. "I'll think about it." That was all I ever said. 3 words that meant nothing. 3 words that had become my way of pacifying them so they'd leave me alone, so they'd still come, so I'd still have someone. Even if that someone wanted nothing from me but my home. It was the lowest I'd felt since Richard died, and that's saying something. Christmas was an exercise in controlled misery. I drove to Marcus and Lena's house on Christmas morning with a backseat full of gifts I'd wrapped carefully. Cashmere socks for Marcus, a silk scarf in a color I'd seen Lena admire once in a magazine. A bottle of wine chosen by the man at the shop who knew about these things. I had dressed with care. I had practiced in the mirror that morning how to smile without looking like I was working at it. The house was beautiful. It always was. Lena had a talent for spaces. Everything carefully arranged, nothing out of place. The kind of home that looks like a photograph of itself. There was a tree with white lights and silver ornaments, a garland along the mantel, candles on every surface. It was lovely and it was cold, and it felt nothing like a home. There were other guests, Lena's sister and her husband, a couple named Daniel and Murray, who worked with Marcus, a woman from Lena's book club, whose name I immediately forgot. I was introduced as Marcus's mother with a pleasant wave of the hand, the way you'd introduce a piece of furniture you're moderately proud of. Evelyn Carter, widow, 65, here, because someone had to be. I ate, I smiled, I said the right things at the right moments. I exclaimed over the food, which was catered and exquisite, and I laughed at the stories the dinner guests told. And when Lena caught my eye across the table once, I gave her the warmest look I had. She gave me back a fraction of a smile and turned away. At one point, Marcus leaned over to me and said quietly near my ear, "You doing okay, Mom?" And I realized with a sudden clear-eyed certainty that was almost like stepping out of a fog into clean air, that he wasn't asking because he cared. He was asking because he wanted me to say yes. He wanted me manageable. He wanted me fine, so there would be no complications. "I'm wonderful," I said. He looked relieved. I looked at my plate. Sightseeing. It was after dinner, while everyone else had drifted toward the living room for drinks and dessert, that I slipped away to the powder room at the end of the hall. I needed 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes alone to be honest with myself, to feel the weight of the day without having to smile through it. I was washing my hands when I heard them. Marcus and Lena, just on the other side of the door, in what I assumed was the small study across the hall, the door half open. Their voices low, but carrying in that particular way voices do in a quiet house. "She looks tired," Marcus was saying. "She always looks tired." Lena's voice flat, dismissive. "It's the age." Still, I wonder if we should push a little harder in the new year. About the condo, the market's not going to stay. We can't push too hard, Lena interrupted, and there was an impatience in her voice like she'd said this before. She gets suspicious. She's smarter than she looks. A pause. "You really think she'll hold out?" Marcus asked. "She can't hold out forever," Lena said. "At her age alone, she's going to need help eventually. We just have to be patient, keep showing up, keep being the concerned family. She can't last much longer." A brief pause, a sound like ice clinking in a glass. "The condo will be ours soon enough." I don't know how long I stood there with the water running over my hands. I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't feel much of anything for a moment. And then everything came in at once, like cold water filling a room. The weight of those words, the exact clinical flatness of Lena's voice, the silence where Marcus's objection should have been and wasn't. She can't last much longer. Not, she might need more support. Not, we're worried about her. Just a waiting game, a calculation with a human being at the center of it, with me at the center of it. I turned off the water. I dried my hands on the little monogrammed towel hanging by the sink. I looked at myself in the mirror above the basin. My face looked back at me, 65 years old, lines at the corners of my eyes, silver at my temples, a tiredness around the mouth that I didn't remember being there a year ago. She can't last much longer. Something moved inside me then, something that had been very still for a very long time. It wasn't rage. Not exactly. Rage is loud and urgent and burns itself out. What moved through me was quieter and older and colder. It was the feeling of a decision being made. Not in my mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere below thought. I was done. Not done with loving my son. That would be like being done with breathing, something too fundamental to simply choose to stop, but done with being afraid of losing him, done with shrinking, done with setting the good dishes and cooking the careful meals and accepting the careless visits and pretending that something was better than nothing, done with waiting to be disposed of. I adjusted my earring. I smoothed my blouse. I smiled at myself in the mirror. And it wasn't the practiced smile I'd been wearing all day. It was something different. It was the smile of a woman with a plan. I walked back into the party. I took a glass of wine from the tray. I spoke warmly to Lena's sister, who turned out to be quite funny and sharp in a way that her sister was not. I said goodnight to Marcus with a long hug and a kiss on the cheek. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," and I said, "Merry Christmas, Mom." He hugged me back, easy, oblivious. I drove home in the dark with the heater running and Christmas music on the radio and my mind very, very quiet. Quiet like the moment before something begins. Yes, dear. That night I sat at Richard's desk, the one I'd moved into the small room off the hallway that I sometimes called my office and more often just called the room with Richard's stuff. And I got out a yellow legal pad and a pen. Richard had been a methodical man. He believed in writing things down. He believed in lists. He used to say, if it's worth doing, it's worth being organized about. So I sat down and I started being organized. At the top of the page I wrote, what do I actually have? And then I started answering that question honestly for the first time in 4 years. The condo, what it was worth roughly. I'd heard numbers in conversation, seen the listings in my building. I had a sense. Richard's life insurance, a sum I hadn't thought about in a long time, sitting in accounts I rarely checked, earning very modest interest. My own retirement savings, modest but real. Social security, starting in 2 years if I chose to wait. My health, good, genuinely good. I walked, I did yoga, I ate well, I slept. Not because I had great discipline, but because I'd stumbled into decent habits. My mind, clear, very clear. Clearer, in fact, than it had been in years. I looked at the list and felt something strange happen in my chest. A kind of recognition, almost like surprise. I wasn't helpless. I had never been helpless. I had just been acting like someone who was. I turned the page and wrote, what do I want? And I sat there a long time with that question. Because no one had asked me that in years. Not really. Not in a way that was genuinely curious about the answer. I wrote slowly. To stay in my own home, or in a home I choose. To feel safe. To stop apologizing. To have people in my life who actually want to be there. To stop feeling like a problem someone has to manage. To paint. I used to paint. I stopped when Richard got sick. I want to start again. I want to not be afraid. The last one surprised me. I hadn't known how afraid I'd been until I wrote it down. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of losing Marcus. Afraid of taking up too much space. Afraid of being a burden, and afraid of being abandoned, and afraid, somewhere deep down, that maybe they were right. Maybe I was someone to be endured rather than loved. I stared at that word, afraid. And then I picked up the pen and crossed it out, hard, so the ink bled through to the next page, and I wrote in its place a single word, done. Nisan. The next morning I called Patricia Henley. Patricia was a real estate attorney. She'd handled some small thing for Richard years ago, a boundary dispute with a neighbor, and I'd liked her immediately. Direct, no nonsense. The kind of woman who listened carefully and then told you exactly what she thought without packaging it in unnecessary softness. I hadn't spoken to her in several years, but I found her card in Richard's desk drawer. Of course he'd kept it, and I dialed her number before I'd had time to talk myself out of it. She remembered me immediately. I liked that. Mrs. Carter, message, she said. It's good to hear from you. What can I do for you? I need to understand my options, I said, regarding my home, and I need to understand them privately. A brief pause, professional and discreet. Privately as in not involving my family. I said, not yet. Understood, and she said, can you come in Friday? Yes, I said, and that was how it started. Not with a scene, not with a confrontation, not with the kind of dramatic declaration that makes for a satisfying story, but very rarely happens in real life. It started with a phone call, a woman's voice saying understood, and a date on a calendar. It started, really, with that yellow legal pad and a word crossed out in ink. Done. I want to be honest with you about something. In those weeks between Christmas and the New Year, I wasn't brave. I want you to understand that I wasn't some steady, clear-eyed woman who had figured it all out and moved through her days with quiet certainty. I was a 65-year-old woman who woke up some nights at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. What if I was wrong? What if I'd misunderstood what I'd heard? What if Marcus really did love me and I was about to destroy something irreparable Because I'd eavesdropped on a half-heard conversation, I turned it over and over. But then I'd remember the sound of Lena's voice. She can't last much longer. Not worried, not sad, flat, clinical, patient. The voice of someone who has made peace with waiting you out. And Marcus's silence where an objection should have been. That silence. That was the thing I couldn't explain away. That was the thing I came back to every time my resolve started to soften. My son had stood in a room and heard his wife talk about his mother like she was an obstacle in a timeline. And he had said nothing, not, Lena, that's not okay, not, I don't think we should talk about her that way. Nothing, just nothing. That silence was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. Friday came. I put on my good coat, dark navy, the one Richard had given me for our 28th anniversary, the one I never wore because it felt like too much, and I drove to Patricia Henley's office, which was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown with old wood paneling and stacks of actual physical files and a receptionist who had clearly been there for 30 years. Patricia was exactly as I remembered, compact, sharp-eyed, with close-cropped grey hair and reading glasses on a chain. She shook my hand firmly and showed me into her office and asked her receptionist for coffee, and then she sat across from me and said, "Tell me what's happening." So I did. I told her about Richard's death, about the visits that became shorter, about the conversation in October about estate planning, about Christmas dinner, and the night I'd spent with a yellow legal pad and the decision I'd made. I told her clearly and without drama, and I only paused once, briefly, when I got to the part about hearing them through the door. Patricia listened without interrupting. She was very good at that. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, her pen still, looking at me over her glasses. "Are you looking to protect your assets from them?" she asked. "I'm looking to understand what belongs to me and what I can do with it," I said. "And I want to make sure that whatever I do, I'm doing it from a position of clarity, not fear." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about what that looks like." And we did, for 2 hours. At the end of it, I walked out of her office into the pale winter light with more information in my head than I'd had walking in, and with the strange, weightless feeling of someone who has finally stopped waiting to be saved and started saving themselves. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, the worst of it. The confrontation, the exposure, the full weight of what I'd discovered and what it meant was still coming. But I was no longer invisible. I had seen myself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as a widow, not as a burden, not as a condo with a heartbeat, as Evelyn Carter. And Evelyn Carter was just getting started. End of part 1. Patricia Henley had given me homework. That's the only way I can describe it. When I left her office that Friday afternoon, I had a yellow legal pad covered in notes. My own handwriting, pressed harder in some places than others, the letters getting smaller and tighter when the information got complicated. She'd walked me through the basics of what I owned, what I controlled, and what, if anything, could be challenged legally if I chose to act without Marcus's involvement. The answer, in plain terms, was everything. I controlled everything. The condo was in my name. Richard's accounts had transferred to me cleanly when he died. My retirement savings were mine alone. I had done nothing, signed nothing, agreed to nothing, transferred nothing that gave Marcus or Lena any legal claim to any of it. Patricia had said it the way she said most things, plainly looking at me straight on. "Mrs. Carter, your son and daughter-in-law have no legal standing here. What they have is proximity and expectation, and you're under no obligation to meet either." I'd nodded like I understood. I did understand intellectually. The emotional part took longer. Because here's what no one tells you about waking up to the truth of a situation. It doesn't feel like freedom, not at first. It feels like standing in a room where all the furniture has been moved, and you keep reaching for things that aren't where they used to be. The story I'd been telling myself, they love me, they're just busy, they mean well, had been the furniture. It had been the structure I'd organized my days around. Without it, Everything felt open and strange and a little terrifying. So I did what Patricia asked. I gathered documents. Bank statements going back 2 years, the condo deed, the insurance policies. Richard's original will, my own will, the papers from the small investment account I'd barely touched since his death. I sorted through the filing cabinet in the room with Richard's desk, and I read things I hadn't read in years, and I sat with the numbers until they stopped feeling abstract and started feeling real. I was not rich. Let me be clear about that. I was not wealthy in any dramatic sense, but I was stable. I was more than stable, actually. I was fine. And that word fine had never felt so significant to me before. Fine. Self-sufficient. Not dependent on anyone for anything. Somewhere along the way, in all the grief and the fog of the years after Richard died, I had forgotten that about myself. Patricia had also told me to document any future conversations with Marcus or Lena about the condo or money. Not secretly, she'd said. Just keep notes. Dates, what was said, your impressions. If this ever becomes a formal dispute, a record matters. I'd bought a small spiral notebook at the drugstore on the way home. Navy blue, nothing fancy. I'd put it in the kitchen drawer beside the spare batteries and the takeout menus. I had no idea then how much I would end up writing in it. January arrived cold and grinding, and Marcus called on the 5th to wish me a happy new year, 3 days late. I didn't say anything about the lateness. I said, "Happy New Year, sweetheart." And I asked about his holidays, a work trip they'd taken to Miami between Christmas and New Year, which I'd known about and which they had not invited me to join, though I understood that. I did. And he talked for a few minutes and then circled, the way he always did now, like water finding a drain. "Have you had any more thoughts about the real estate thing?" "I've been doing some thinking," I said. Which was true. Great. His voice brightened. "Lena's been doing a lot of research, actually. There's a woman she knows who's a really excellent agent. Handled a few properties in your building, actually. Knows the market really well. She could come by, give you a number, no commitment. No commitment. Like I was a customer being offered a free trial." "That's thoughtful of her," I said. "Let me look at my calendar." He gave me the woman's name, Sandra Reeves, and said he'd have Lena send over her contact information. And then we talked for 4 more minutes about nothing in particular and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee. I took out the Navy notebook. I wrote, January 5th, Marcus called. Pushed again on selling the condo. Named a specific agent. Sandra Reeves, referred by Lena. Said Lena has been doing a lot of research. Did not ask how I was doing, how I spent New Year's, or whether I was feeling okay. I put the pen down and looked at what I'd written. In 4 years of widowhood, in all the Sunday dinners, and the dutiful visits, and the conversations about my house and my money, my son had never once asked me, "Mom, are you happy?" I wrote that down too, because it seemed important, because it felt like something I needed to see in ink. The second week of January, I had a medical appointment, just a routine check-in with my primary care doctor, a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, who I genuinely liked, who had the gift of making you feel seen rather than processed. She asked all the usual questions and reviewed my blood work and said everything looked good, and then, at the end, the way she always did, she asked, "How are things at home, emotionally?" I had always answered this question with some version of fine, managing, getting along. That day I said, "I've had a hard few months." She looked at me, really looked over her glasses, and said, "Tell me." So I told her a little of it, not everything, enough. I told her about the loneliness and about feeling like I'd become invisible, and about the specific particular exhaustion of performing okayness for an audience that didn't even notice the performance. She listened. Then she said, "Have you considered a therapist? Not because anything is wrong with you, sir, but because you're navigating something genuinely complicated and doing it alone. A good therapist is like a really smart friend who has no stake in the outcome." I said I'd think about it. She wrote down a name before I left, Dr. Joyce Moran, who had an office 15 minutes from my building and specialized in life transitions. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket and drove home and forgot about it for 2 weeks. And then at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, when the quiet in my condo felt so complete it had weight, I unfolded it and made the appointment. That, too, would turn out to matter more than I expected. But that was later. What came first was Marcus and Lena's visit on a Saturday in late January. And it was the visit that made everything real in a way that documents and phone calls had not. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon and brought with them a folder. An actual folder. Buff-colored, letter-sized, held shut with a clip. Marcus carried it under his arm like it was an ordinary thing to bring to your mother's home on a Saturday afternoon, the way you might bring a bottle of wine or a box of pastries. I looked at it when he walked in, and something in my stomach went very still. "Is that for me?" I asked. "Just some stuff we put together," Marcus said easily. "Nothing heavy, just some information." I made tea because that was what I did, and because moving around my kitchen gave me a moment to collect myself. I could hear them in the living room, the low murmur of their voices. And I focused on the kettle and the cups and the ordinary domestic business of getting through the next few hours. We sat at the kitchen table. Lena laid the folder between us, centered like evidence at a meeting. She opened it. "So we've done a lot of research," she began, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she was performing reasonableness. Slightly too even, slightly too measured. "We know this is a sensitive topic and we want to approach it the right way. But we also love you, Evelyn, and we want to make sure you're protected." I kept my face pleasant. I'd been practicing. "The first thing we want you to look at is the market analysis," she said, sliding a printed page across the table toward me. It had a letterhead at the top, Sandra Reeves, Reeves Residential Properties, and below it a carefully formatted document showing comparable sales in my building and the surrounding area. It was professional, it was thorough. It had clearly taken effort. The number at the bottom, the estimated value of my condo, was significant. I looked at it for a moment and then I looked up at Lena. "She did an informal assessment," Lena said, "without going through the listing process, obviously, just so you have an idea of what you're working with. This woman came into my home without my knowledge?" I asked. "Not your home," Marcus said quickly. "She just pulled the comps. It's public record data." "I see." I set the page down. "The second thing is this." Lena slid over another page, a glossy brochure, the kind with soft focus photography of smiling elderly people in sunlit common rooms and manicured gardens. "Meadowbrook Senior Living Community, where your next chapter begins." "We went and toured it," she said. 2 weeks ago. It's really beautiful, Evelyn. The facilities are incredible. There's a pool, a full dining program, activities every day. It's not what people picture when they hear assisted living," I said, a pause. "When they hear senior community," Lena corrected, smooth as a brushstroke. "It's a continuum of care, which means you could start in independent living and have access to more support if you ever needed it, without any disruption." I looked at Marcus. He was watching me with a careful expression. Hopeful, I thought. He wanted me to say yes. He wanted this to be easy. "And if I sell the condo," I said slowly, looking back at Lena, "what happens to the money?" "Well, Meadowbrook has a buy-in model for independent living. You pay an entrance fee up front, which gives you lifetime rights to your unit." She slid a third page forward with figures on it. My eyes went to the numbers. The entrance fee was substantial, not the full value of the condo, but close. "So most of it goes to Meadowbrook," I said. "It would cover your housing and care for the rest of your life," Lena said, as if that answered the question. "And the remainder?" I asked. "Whatever's left after the entrance fee." Another pause, shorter this time. Something flickered across Lena's face and was gone. That would obviously be yours to do with as you see fit, she said, obviously. There was that word again, the word that got used when the thing being described was not obvious at all. There are also financial planning tools that can help structure the remaining assets efficiently, Lena continued, in terms of gifting strategies and estate minimization, again, to protect what you've built and make sure it goes where you'd want it. Gifting strategies, I repeated. I looked at her. She looked back at me. You mean giving money to you and Marcus, I said. The temperature in the room changed. Marcus shifted in his chair. Mom, I'm just clarifying, I said pleasantly. I want to make sure I understand. Lena's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something pulled tight. We're talking about legally sound tax minimization strategies, she said. Annual gift exclusions, for example. Completely normal financial planning. Completely normal, I agreed. We looked at each other. I picked up the brochure again, looked at it carefully, set it down. I appreciate you putting this together, I said. Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding. I'll think about it, I said. And there it was again, my 3-word escape hatch. Marcus relaxed. Lena gathered the folder back together and clipped it shut with a quiet, business-like snap. We drank our tea and talked about other things. His work, a restaurant they'd been to recently, some minor renovation they were considering for the guest bathroom of their house. And they left at 4 o'clock, and I stood at the window and watched them go. Then I went to the kitchen drawer and took out the navy notebook. I wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When I put the pen down, my hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, from something else, from the sheer accumulated weight of it, of sitting across from my son and his wife and watching them lay out in buff-colored folders and glossy brochures their plan for the end of my independence, and having to smile through every word of it. I thought of Richard. I thought about what he would have said if he'd been in that room. Richard, who had been patient and quiet and deeply fair, but who had a line, and when someone crossed it, his voice went flat, and everything else in the room went very still. He would have said, I think you two should leave now. I wasn't there yet, but I was getting close. In the weeks that followed, something in me changed that I can only describe as a kind of settling. The anxious second-guessing quality that had been humming underneath everything started to quiet. Not because the situation had gotten better, it hadn't, but because I was no longer waiting to understand what was happening. I knew what was happening. And knowing, even when what you know is painful, is steadier than not knowing. I met with Patricia again. I brought the folder they'd given me. I'd photographed every page on my phone and laid it on her desk. She looked through it carefully, and then she looked at me. They're more organized than I expected, she said. Lena is thorough, I said. Has anything been signed? Any documents, any agreements, anything that went beyond verbal conversation? No, I said, nothing. She nodded. Good, let's keep it that way. She leaned back in her chair. And you've been keeping notes? I put the navy notebook on her desk. She picked it up, read several pages, and set it down. Good, she said again. This is good, Mrs. Carter. I asked her what my realistic options were. She laid them out for me, straightforwardly, without drama. I could do nothing, which would mean the pressure from Marcus and Lena would continue and likely escalate. I could involve a third party, a mediator, or a financial advisor of my own choosing, to formalize conversations and create distance. Or I could act unilaterally, make my own decisions about my own assets without consulting or informing them, and present them with a fait accompli when the time came. That third option has the most risk emotionally, Patricia said. I know. It could fracture the relationship permanently. I know. But legally, it's your cleanest play. You own everything. You have full rights. There is nothing they can do to stop you from making your own financial decisions. I know, I said. And then, can I ask you something? Of course. If you were me and this was your son, I paused. What would you do? She was quiet for a moment. Patricia Henley was not a woman who answered questions quickly when they deserved to be considered. Then she said, I'd protect myself, not out of anger, because you can't love anyone well from a position of dependency and fear. You're not in a place to offer your son a real relationship right now. You're in survival mode, and a mother in survival mode can't give her child what he actually needs from her, which, whatever he thinks he wants, is a mother with some dignity and backbone. I didn't say anything for a moment. Thank you, I said finally. She shrugged. It's probably easier for me to say than to hear. It was. It took me 3 days to fully absorb it. 3 days of walking around my condo with it, picking it up and putting it down, turning it over. You can't love anyone well from a position of dependency and fear. I thought about the visits I'd sat through, the meals I'd cooked out of desperation rather than joy, the 3-word answers I'd given when they pushed, buying myself another few weeks of their presence at the cost of my own honesty. Was that love? Was that what I'd been offering my son? No, it was fear wearing love's clothing, and I was tired of it. The 3rd week of February brought Dr. Joyce Moran into my life. Her office was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house, and it had mismatched furniture and a small sound machine outside the door, and a bookcase that covered an entire wall. She was a small, compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses. She took off and on constantly, and the particular quality of attention that makes you feel very quickly that she is genuinely interested in you and not just professionally obligated to appear so. I had not been in therapy before. Richard and I had been of a generation that solved things by pushing through, and I'd never questioned that until I sat down in Dr. Moran's office that first day and realized within about 15 minutes that I had been carrying things alone for so long that I'd forgotten there was another option. She asked about Richard first, not about Marcus, not about the condo situation, not about what had brought me in. She asked about Richard. What kind of man he'd been, how we'd met, what I missed most about him. I told her about the puddle jumping, the Route 66 plans, the way he'd sat on the edge of our bed every morning and done these small, half-conscious stretches before standing up, something he'd done for 30 years and that I had found irritating for most of them, and now would have given almost anything to see again. I told her I still sometimes set 2 coffee cups in the morning. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you've been in mourning for 4 years. Yes. And the people around you, particularly your son and his wife, have they been in mourning with you? Have they shared that grief in any real way? I thought about it honestly. No, I said, I don't think they have. So you've been carrying that alone? Yes. And then carrying the weight of their expectations and pressure on top of that? Yes. That's a tremendous amount of weight, Mrs. Carter. Evelyn Said, I said. Evelyn. She looked at me steadily. Can I ask you something direct? Please. When did you stop thinking of your own needs as valid? The question landed like a stone in still water. I felt the ripple move through me. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the bookcase, at the spines of books whose titles I couldn't quite read from where I sat. Then I said, somewhere around the time Richard died, I think. I couldn't ask anything of anyone because everyone else was grieving too, or they seemed to be, and so I just stopped asking, stopped expecting. And your son, was he grieving his father? I thought so, in those early months. And then, I said slowly, he seemed to transition from grieving his father to thinking about what his father had left behind. Joyce Moran wrote something down. Evelyn, she said, grief can do many things to people. For some, it opens them up, makes them tender and honest. For others, she paused. For others, it reveals what was already there, priorities that existed before the loss, but were kept out of sight by ordinary life. I thought about that for a long time after I left her office. The rest of February was quiet in the particular way that something quiet is when it's holding its breath. Marcus called twice. Both times the conversation followed the same script. How are you? Fine. Have you thought more about the situation? I'm thinking about it. Sandra Reeves is very flexible about scheduling whenever you want to have that conversation. No pressure. Okay, I'll let you know. I love you, Mom. I love you too. I said I love you and I meant it, and it meant nothing in the context of what was happening. That was the part I was learning to hold without tearing apart. That two things can both be true. That a son can be loved and also be wrong. That you can miss someone who's standing right in front of you. That love, real love, the bone deep kind, does not exempt anyone from accountability. Richard had known that. He'd loved Marcus fiercely, but he'd never been soft about it. When Marcus was 16 and got caught cheating on an exam, Richard had sat him down and said, "I'm not angry because you disappointed me. I'm angry because you're better than that and you chose not to be. There's a difference." Marcus had shaped up, temporarily at least. The lesson had taken, even if imperfectly. I wondered sometimes what Richard would have done with the man his son had become. Whether he would have seen it coming, whether he would have blamed himself. Then I remembered that it wasn't useful to wonder, and I put it down. March arrived and the pressure shifted. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most things do. Marcus had been escalating his calls weekly, then twice weekly, patient and steady, like someone who believes eventually you'll wear down. Lena had texted me 3 times with links to articles about senior communities, each text accompanied by a brief cheerful message. "Thought of you, looks amazing," as if she was sending me pictures of restaurants she wanted to try. Then on a Thursday evening in early March, Marcus called, and his voice was different. Not warm, not the careful performed warmth I'd learned to see through. It was tighter. The patience had rubbed thin. "Mom, we really need to move on this." "Move on what exactly?" "And the condo. Sandra Reeves says the spring market is when you want to list. It's already March, and if we don't move soon—" "Marcus," I said, "I haven't agreed to sell." A pause, short and sharp. "I know you haven't agreed," and he said, "but we've been talking about this for months, and you keep saying you'll think about it, and I'm trying to understand what's holding you back." "It's my home," I said. "I know it is. The home your father and I shared for 22 years. "Mom, a home I haven't made any decisions about selling," I said, "because I haven't decided to sell it." The silence that followed was different from the other silences in our conversations. There was something hard underneath this one. "Is someone talking to you, see?" he said. I went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, has someone been advising you against this? Because you've been different lately. Since Christmas, you've been—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm just worried about you, Mom. I don't want someone to be taking advantage of you." The irony was so complete, it was almost elegant. "I'm taking care of myself, Marcus," I said. "Of course you are, but you're not, He stopped again. "I'm not what?" I asked. The silence stretched one beat too long. "You're not as young as you used to be," he said, and then, as if realizing how that had sounded, "I just meant that these financial decisions are complicated, and it's easy to make mistakes. I need to go," I said. "Mom." "Good night, Marcus." I hung up the phone. I sat at my kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, feeling the coolness of it, and I breathed steadily until the shakiness in my chest settled. "You're not as young as you used to be." That was what it came to. Strip away the folders and the brochures and the real estate agents and the carefully worded suggestions, and it came to that: you're old, you're alone, and we are waiting. We are patient, but we are waiting. I reached for the navy notebook, but first I sat with it, the full weight of what had just been said, because it deserved to be felt, not rushed past. My son had just told me up in the careful language of concern, in the guise of love, that he thought I was losing the capacity to run my own life. My son, that boy who jumped in puddles, that boy who held my hand in the hospital, that man who was standing in my hallway in my memory with his father's eyes, looking at me across 30 years of love, and had somehow become someone I needed to protect myself from. I felt it fully. I didn't push it away. I let it hurt. And then I picked up the pen. March 8th, I wrote. Marcus called. For the first time, stopped performing, patience. Said, "I'm not as young as I used to be. implied my judgment is impaired, asked whether someone is advising me against the condo decision. First sign of aggression beneath the performance. I closed the notebook. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, which I don't even particularly like, but Richard used to drink it at night, and sometimes it still comforted me. The familiar smell of it in the steam. I sat in the kitchen and I thought about what Patricia had said, about what Joyce had said, about what I had written on that yellow legal pad in January, alone at Richard's desk with a pen in my hand, and the particular clarity that comes at the end of a long night. Done. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the woman who set 2 coffee cups each morning and ate her carefully cooked meals alone and counted the days between her son's visits and told herself that something was better than nothing. And I thought about the woman I was becoming. Not polished, not certain, still afraid some nights, still grief-heavy, still flawed in all the ordinary human ways. But seeing clearly, moving deliberately, keeping notes, building something. The condo around me was quiet. The tea was cooling in the cup. Outside, March was being miserable. Rain against the windows, grey sky pressing down. But inside, something was very carefully, very quietly shifting into place. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do or precisely when. Patricia and I were still talking through options, still working through the practicalities. Joyce was helping me get steady enough to act from clarity rather than panic. But I knew it was coming. I knew that the next time Marcus walked into my home with that careful, patient expression, something would be different, because I would be different. I just didn't know yet that what would change everything completely, irrevocably, before I was even ready, wasn't going to come from me. It was going to come from them. The thing about a decision you've truly made, not just considered, not just circled around in the dark at 3 a.m, but actually genuinely made, is that it has a different quality than everything that came before it. It's quieter, steadier. It doesn't need to announce itself. I woke up on a Friday in mid-March and lay in the dark for my usual few minutes, and when I opened my eyes, the room looked the same as it always did. The pale curtains, the shadows on the ceiling, the photograph of Richard and me on our 25th anniversary, sitting on the dresser. But something had settled overnight that I hadn't been able to settle by thinking alone. I knew what I was going to do, not the full shape of it yet, not every practical detail, but the core of it, the direction. I was going to stop waiting for the right moment and start making the right moment. I was going to take back the narrative of my own life from 2 people who had been quietly rewriting it without my permission, and I was going to do it carefully and thoroughly and without flinching, and I was going to do it alone. I got up and made coffee, 1 cup the way I'd been practicing, and I called Patricia Henley at 8:30. Her receptionist put me through immediately. "I'm ready," I said when she picked up. A brief pause. "Ready to move forward?" "Yes." "All right," she said, and I could hear in her voice that she wasn't surprised. "Come in Monday and we'll lay out the full timeline." That Monday meeting was 2 hours long and covered more ground than anything we'd discussed before. Patricia had been doing her own preparation. She had contacts in residential real estate she trusted. She had a financial advisor she recommended for people in my situation. She had a clear sequence of steps she'd thought through carefully. She laid it all out for me in her direct, unfussy way, and I sat across from her and took notes. And by the time I walked out, I had a plan that was real and specific, and for the first time in months, entirely mine. The first step was finding my own real estate agent. Not Sandra Reeves, who was Lena's contact and whose loyalty would inevitably run in that direction, but someone independent, someone who had no existing relationship with my son or his wife. Patricia gave me 2 names. I called both. I liked the second one, a woman named Carol Dempsey, who had been selling properties in my area for 18 years, and who had, in our first phone call, said exactly one thing that made me certain she was the right person. "Mrs. Carter, You tell me what you need from this process, and I'll build the strategy around that, not the other way around. Carol came to see the condo on a Wednesday afternoon and walked through it with the quiet, appraising competence of someone who knows what she's doing and doesn't need to perform it. She looked at the southeast-facing windows and the original hardwood floors and the kitchen I'd updated 7 years ago and the view of the small park across the street. And when she sat down at my table, she gave me a number that made my breath catch slightly. Not because it was shocking, but because it was real, concrete, not a conversation anymore. You're in a strong position, she said. Honestly, you could ask for more than I'm quoting and probably get it in this market. I want a clean sale, I said, not a prolonged negotiation. She nodded. Then we price it right, stage it well, and you'll have offers within 2 weeks of listing, probably less. What's the timeline from listing to close? 30 to 45 days, depending on the buyer's financing. I did the math quietly in my head. If we moved forward immediately, I could be out of this condo and into something of my own choosing before the spring was over. Let's do it, I said. Carol looked at me for a moment. Not skeptically, just reading. You're sure? Because once we list, things move quickly. I know, I said. That's what I want. What I hadn't told Carol, what I hadn't told anyone except Patricia, was the other part of the plan, that I had already found where I wanted to go. I had spent 3 evenings the week before looking at listings online. Not senior communities, not Meadowbrook or anything resembling it, but regular condominiums. Smaller than mine, naturally. 1 bedroom instead of 2, because I only used 1 bedroom anyway, and the extra space had become a kind of sad monument to a life that had held more people in it than it did now. I wanted something with good light and a manageable layout and a neighborhood with actual life in it. A coffee shop within walking distance, a park, maybe a library nearby. I found it on the 3rd evening. It was on the 4th floor of a newer building, about 12 minutes from where I currently lived, with large windows facing west, and a small balcony that got afternoon sun, and a kitchen that was compact and smart and had clearly been designed by someone who actually cooked. The building had a fitness room and a small garden courtyard, and according to the listing, a very active community board that organized events. I looked at those photographs for a long time. It looked like a place where a person could start over, where a woman could open a window in the morning and feel like the day belonged to her. I called the listing agent the next morning, and here is where I need to be honest about something uncomfortable, because I said at the beginning of the story that I was going to tell it truthfully, and truthfully means the parts that don't make me look entirely composed and certain. I cried in the car on the way home from touring that apartment. Not from sadness exactly, or not only from sadness. It was more complicated than that, a tangle of grief and relief and guilt, and something that was almost hope but not quite yet, because hope still felt dangerous to hold. I sat in the parking garage beneath my current building with the engine off and let it come, all of it, the whole knotted mess of it. And I thought about Richard and about the 22 years we'd spent in this condo and about the specific kind of grief that comes from leaving a place where you were once happy, not because the happiness ended, but because you've outgrown the need to stay in its shadow. I missed him. God, I missed him. Not the abstract missing that had become background noise over 4 years, but the sharp specific kind. I missed his particular opinion about the west-facing apartment. I missed the way he would have stood in the kitchen and tested the counter height and opened and closed the cabinets and given me a look that meant either this is right or keep looking. I miss being the kind of woman who made decisions with someone. But I was not that woman anymore. And sitting in that parking garage, I understood something important. The version of Evelyn Carter who existed only in relation to other people, Richard's wife, Marcus's mother, someone, had been a real woman, and I had loved being her. But she was gone, and grieving her was not the same as needing to remain her. I dried my face. I went upstairs. I made dinner. The next morning I called Patricia and told her I'd found the apartment. Good, she said. Then we have a real sequence to work with. We listed the condo on a Thursday in late March. I did not tell Marcus. I want to sit with that for a moment because I know how it sounds. I know that the words, "I did not tell my son I was selling his childhood home," carry a particular weight. And I'm not going to minimize that by wrapping it in justification. It was a hard choice. It was the right choice. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I've learned to hold them that way. The real reason underneath all the practical and legal reasons Patricia and I had discussed was this. The moment Marcus knew, he would act. He had been patient for months, working through suggestion and pressure and carefully worded concern, but underneath that patience was something that would not absorb this news quietly. And I needed to be further along, signed, under contract, committed, before that conversation happened. Because if I told him while I could still be talked out of it, there was a version of me that might be talked out of it. I still loved my son. That's the part that made it hard. If I'd stopped loving him, it would have been simple. Carol was efficient and professional, and the listing went up with photographs that made my condo look like what it actually was. A beautiful, well-maintained home with excellent light and a view that softened even the hardest February morning. By the following Tuesday, we had 4 inquiries. By Thursday, we had 2 offers. The second offer was the one. A young couple, both teachers, who had been searching for 8 months and who wrote a letter the way buyers sometimes do, about what the condo meant to them, about their plans and their particular hope for a life that was just beginning. Carol read me the letter over the phone, and I sat at my kitchen table and listened and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was uncomplicated, something that was simply good. They want to close in 30 days if possible, Carol said. That works, Umesh, I said. Evelyn, her voice was careful. Once you accept, the clock starts. You'll need to be ready to move. I'm ready, I said. I accepted the offer that afternoon. I signed the purchase agreement on the new apartment 2 days later. The west-facing one with the balcony and the afternoon sun. I put down a deposit that was precisely what I'd planned for, leaving the rest of the sale proceeds to settle cleanly into my accounts. Then I started packing. I want to tell you about the packing because it was its own kind of grief and its own kind of freedom mixed together, and I think it matters to the story. I had lived in that condo for 22 years of accumulated life, the furniture, the books, the kitchen equipment, the accumulated miscellany of a shared existence that no one ever quite knows what to do with. Richard's desk, which I would take with me, his reading chair, which I would not. It was too big for the new space, and I admitted to myself quietly, possibly too heavy with memory to carry forward. His books, which I sorted into 2 piles. The ones I loved or intended to read, and the ones I boxed for donation, running my hand along the spines before I put them in the box, saying goodbye to them in my own private way. The hardest thing was the closet. I had kept Richard's side of the closet mostly intact for 4 years. Not obsessively. I hadn't turned it into a shrine, but I hadn't cleared it either, and so his clothes hung there in the dark, his shirts organized by color the way he'd always kept them, a row of shoes on the floor below. Packing out that closet took me an entire afternoon, and I'm not going to tell you I managed it without stopping, because I didn't. I stopped several times. I sat on the edge of the bed and I sat with it. And then I got up and I kept going. That, I think, was the truest thing about all of it. I kept going. I was 3 weeks into this process, the condo under contract, the new apartment signed, boxes stacked along the hallway wall. When Marcus called on a Sunday morning, he didn't know yet. I was certain of that. If he'd known, the conversation would have started differently. It started the way they always started. Hey Mom, how are you? Fine, I said. Good, actually. A beat. My good actually was different from my usual fine, and he heard it. Yeah? You sound different. Do I? Just, I don't know, lighter maybe. He didn't mean it as a compliment. He meant it as a question. Listen, I'm calling because Lena and I were thinking of coming by Saturday. It's been a while. It had been 5 weeks since the phone call where he told me I wasn't as young as I used to be. 5 weeks of twice weekly calls and carefully maintained pleasantness and my 3-word answers, and nothing resolved. Saturday works, I said. Great, around 2? That's fine. Is everything okay with the condo? I noticed you hadn't mentioned the real estate thing lately, and there it was. He couldn't help it. Even in a casual check-in, it surfaced. Everything's fine, I said. Good. We can talk more Saturday. We can, I agreed. I hung up and went back to the kitchen where I'd been having my coffee, and I sat down and looked at the room around me. The boxes along the wall, the empty space on the bookshelf where Richard's books had been, the pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung for 22 years. Saturday was in 6 days. The sale would close in 11. I had been careful, more careful than I'd known I was capable of being. The listing had gone up quietly and come down quickly, the way things do when they sell fast. I'd used Carol's brokerage, which was not a firm that Marcus or Lena had any connection to. The paperwork had gone through Patricia's office. I had not discussed it with anyone in my personal life except Joyce, who had sat with me through the emotional weight of it without once telling me what to do. But here is the thing about plans and the gap between them and reality. Reality has its own timing. It was Thursday, 2 days before Marcus and Lena's visit, 9 days before closing, when my neighbor Dorothy Farwell knocked on my door. Dorothy was 72 and had lived in the building for 15 years and was the kind of neighbor who notices everything and says so without embarrassment. She was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil, which she held out to me when I opened the door. I made too much chicken and rice, and she said, take it. Dorothy, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked past me into the hallway and her expression shifted. Evelyn, are those moving boxes? I looked at her. She looked at me. Are you selling? She asked, and her voice had dropped, gone soft with something that was not quite concern and not quite alarm, but lived somewhere between them. I am, I said. Oh, honey. She stepped forward unexpectedly and hugged me, the casserole dish still in her hands, an awkward embrace that somehow managed to be exactly right. When did this happen? Why didn't you say anything? I needed to do it quietly, I said. She pulled back and looked at me carefully, the way women of a certain age look at each other when they understand that there's more being said than is being said. Is everything all right? It will be it, I said. Dorothy came in and we drank coffee, and she didn't push, to her credit. She told me about the young couple she'd seen touring the unit last week, the teachers. She'd noticed them in the lobby, thought they seemed nice. I said they were. We talked about other things for 40 minutes, and then she went back upstairs, and I stood in my hallway with the casserole and thought, I have one more day before this becomes impossible to contain. I was right about that. Friday afternoon, 3:15. My phone rang, and it was a number I didn't recognize, and I answered it out of instinct. Mrs. Carter, this is James Whitford. I'm a friend of Marcus's. We went to business school together. I'm sorry to call out of the blue like this, but Marcus asked me to reach out. He said you might be selling your condo. The bottom of my stomach dropped. I'm not sure where Marcus got that idea, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Inside, every nerve had gone sharp, a pause on his end. He said, I'm sorry, maybe I've got the wrong information. He said he'd seen a listing, thought it might be yours. I'll have to speak with Marcus, I said. I'm sorry you were put in the middle of this. I hung up. I sat for about 30 seconds, very still. Then I called Carol. Someone's seen the listing, I said when she picked up. A friend of Marcus's. He contacted me just now. Evelyn, the listing was already pulled when it went under contract, Carol said. If someone saw it, they saw it in the window before that. Can Marcus do anything legally to interfere with the sale? No, she said without hesitation. The contract is signed by you as the sole owner. He has no standing. And the purchase of the new place? Also solely in your name. Okay, I said. Evelyn. Carol's voice was steady and sure. the voice of someone who had navigated complicated situations before. "You have done everything correctly. Everything is legal. Everything is documented. And you are 7 business days from closing. There is nothing he can do." I breathed. "Okay," I said again. I knew, putting down the phone, that the timeline had just compressed dramatically. Marcus would call tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. He would come before Saturday. The visit we'd scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon was suddenly irrelevant. He wasn't going to wait. I called Patricia. I explained what had happened. She listened and then said, "Are you ready for the conversation? Tell me what you need me to do. Don't confirm anything until we've reviewed your position one more time. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Yes." 9 o'clock. Bring the Navy notebook. I spent Friday evening doing something that might sound strange given the circumstances. I cooked, not to feed anyone, not out of a desire to be hospitable, but because cooking had been my way of thinking ever since I could remember, and I needed to think. I made a pot of the chicken and vegetable soup, my 1,000-time recipe, the one that lives in my hands. And while I stirred and waited, I went through what I knew. Marcus had seen the listing. He didn't know yet that the sale was done, that contracts were signed, that the whole thing had been moving quietly and cleanly for 3 weeks, while he'd been making twice weekly calls asking if I'd thought about it anymore. He didn't know that I'd found a new place, or that I'd already paid the deposit, or that 9 days from now I would legally own an apartment he'd never set foot in, and that the money from this condo would be entirely, securely mine. He didn't know that his mother had not been sitting still, and I thought about what Patricia had told me in our very first meeting, back in December when the plan was still forming and I was still trembling slightly with the sheer weight of it. "You are under no obligation to ask permission for decisions that are legally and entirely yours to make." I hadn't asked permission. I hadn't lied. I hadn't told Marcus anything that wasn't true. I had simply stopped telling him things that were none of his business. My home, my money, my life. The soup was done. I turned off the heat. I served myself a bowl and ate it at the kitchen table with the boxes stacked along the walls and the pale rectangles where the pictures used to be. And it was the best meal I'd had in months. Not because the soup was exceptional, but because I was eating it in the full knowledge of what I'd done and what was coming, and had chosen to do it anyway. I slept that night. Actually slept. 9 o'clock Saturday morning, Patricia's office. She looked at me across her desk with the expression I'd come to recognize as her equivalent of, "You've done well, but brace yourself. He called you yet?" "Not yet." I'm surprised. "He's deciding how to approach it." She folded her hands on the desk. "When he comes, and he will come in person, I'd almost guarantee it. You need to be ready for several things. First, he's going to be angry. Possibly very angry. The performance of concern will drop. Second, he may make claims that you owe him this money, that you promised something, that Dad intended it for him. None of those claims have any legal basis, but they will feel like attacks, and you need to be prepared for that." "I know," I said. "Third, and this is important, Evelyn, he may try to invoke emotion in a way that is designed to destabilize you. He may say things that are intended to hurt, not because he's necessarily a monster, but because people who feel they're losing something they counted on often reach for whatever weapon is closest." I thought about, she can't last much longer. "I've already heard the worst of it," I said quietly, "in that hallway at Christmas." Patricia looked at me steadily. "Then you know what this is. You know what it isn't." "Yes." "And the documentation?" I put the Navy notebook on her desk. I also put down a folder I'd assembled in the last 2 weeks. Photographs of the buff-colored folder they'd brought to my kitchen in January, the Meadowbrook brochure, the Sandra Reeves market analysis, the notes from every phone call since October where the condo had come up. I'd organized it by date the way Richard would have. Patricia opened the folder and went through it methodically, page by page. When she finished, she looked up. "This is enough, Aunt," she said. This establishes a clear pattern of financial pressure over a sustained period. If this ever needs to go to a third party, a mediator, or further, you have what you need. Do you think it will go further? That depends entirely on him, she said. If he accepts it, if he understands that it's done, and there's nothing to contest, then no, it ends here. And if he doesn't? She tilted her head. Then you have very good ammunition. I drove home from Patricia's office at 11:15 on a Saturday morning, and as I pulled into the parking garage, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I looked at it before I turned off the engine. Marcus. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I picked it up. Marcus. Mom. His voice was different from any version I'd heard before. The patience was completely gone. I need you to tell me what's going on. What do you mean? Don't. Short, hard. James Whitford called me and said he talked to you. He said he saw a listing for your condo. I looked it up. It was your address, Mom. It was your unit. I said nothing. You listed the condo, he said, without telling me. After everything we've been... He stopped, took a breath. What did you do? I made a decision about my property, and I said, silence. Is it under contract? He asked. And his voice was very controlled now, very deliberate, the voice of someone who is keeping something contained by sheer effort. Yes. Another silence. Longer. When were you going to tell me? I'm telling you now. Mom. And the control cracked just slightly, just enough. I could hear it. You can't do this. You can't just... That's not just your... He stopped. I waited. That money, he said, that's Dad's money too. That's family money. You can't just take that and... Marcus. My voice was quiet, completely quiet. Stop. He stopped. That is my home, I said. My name is on the deed. My name alone, because your father and I retitled it into my name alone when we updated our estate planning 7 years ago. Every dollar that comes from that sale is mine, legally and completely. I want to be very clear about that. Mom, you're being careful, I said. I'm being careful with what I say next. And then, because the moment had arrived and there was no more waiting, I said it plainly and without cruelty. I know what you've been doing, Marcus. I know what the visits were about, and I know what the folders were about, and I know what Sandra Reeves was about. I know that you have been waiting, you and Lena both, for me to either give you this money voluntarily or become too old and confused to stop you from taking it. I know because I heard you say so at Christmas. Through the study door. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. And in that silence I heard everything. Not remorse, not yet. That would come later, and even then imperfectly. What I heard was the sound of someone realizing that the ground beneath them is not what they thought it was. Mom, I'm not finished, I said. I have documentation, Marcus. Every conversation since October where the condo came up. Every visit where Lena looked around my home like she was measuring it. The folder they brought to my kitchen in January. The real estate agent who was never my agent, all of it. A sound on his end that might have been a breath or might have been something breaking. I am not going to fight you, I said, I am not going to involve lawyers unless you force me to. I am not going to tell you that you're a bad son because I don't fully believe that, but I'm going to tell you this once, clearly, so that there is no confusion. The money from this condo is mine. The new home I'm moving into is mine. My life, the one I am choosing on my terms for myself, is mine. And if you want any part of it, you're going to have to come to me honestly, as my son, not as someone who is waiting for me to stop being useful. I stopped. My heart was hammering, but my voice had not shaken, not once. The silence on Marcus's end stretched for a long time, long enough that I thought he might have hung up without my hearing it. Then he said in a voice I had not heard from him since he was a child, raw and small, and stripped of everything he'd layered over it. Mom, did you actually think I wanted you to die? It hit me somewhere deep. I won't pretend it didn't. I heard what you said. I said quietly. And I heard what you didn't say. What you didn't say was the loudest part. Another silence. I'm coming over, he said. All right, I said, come over. And I sat in the parking garage for another 2 full minutes before I could make myself move. Because no matter how prepared you are, no matter how long you've known the conversation is coming, the moment of it still has weight. It still lands on you like something physical, because this wasn't a stranger. This wasn't an enemy. This was the boy who'd held my hand in the hospital and cried over a dog named Chester and said, "You're the only person in this world who actually knows me." This was my son. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then I picked up my bag and I went upstairs. I put the kettle on. I unlocked the door and I waited for the last time for Marcus Carter to arrive. Not as someone I was afraid of losing, but as someone I was finally ready to face. He arrived 40 minutes after the phone call. I heard the knock 3 times. His usual knock, the same rhythm he'd had since he was a teenager. And I stood in my kitchen for a moment before I went to the door. The kettle had already boiled and gone quiet. 2 cups on the counter. Old habit that. Even now, I opened the door. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept, which was impossible because he'd only known for 40 minutes. But grief and shock do strange things to a person's face. Compressed time in the lines around the mouth and eyes, and what I saw standing in my doorway was not the polished, careful man who'd been showing up for months with his folders and his patience. It was someone rawer than that, someone younger in a strange way and more frightened. Lena was not with him. I noticed that immediately and filed it away. "Come in, Saeed," I said. He came in. He stood in the hallway and looked at the boxes stacked against the wall. There were more of them now, labeled in my handwriting, taped and ordered. And something moved across his face that I couldn't immediately name. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. "You're really doing this?" he said. "Yes." He looked at me. His jaw was tight. "Can we sit down?" "Of course." We went to the kitchen. I poured water over the tea bags and set a cup in front of him and sat across the table. The same table where we'd sat in January when Lena laid out her buff-colored folder with Sandra Reeves's letterhead. The same table where I'd watched them perform concern for 2 hours over wine she'd brought as a prop. It was a different table now, in a way. I was a different person sitting at it. Marcus wrapped both hands around his cup and didn't drink. "How long?" he asked. "Since December," I said. "I hired an attorney in December." But he closed his eyes briefly. "Mom, you gave me reason to, Marcus." "I know," he said, and those 2 words, simple and flat and without the careful framing he usually gave everything, were the most honest thing he'd said to me in a very long time. I felt them land. "Okay," I said quietly. "Then tell me." He looked up. "Tell you what?" "Tell me what you knew, what you were part of, what Lena planned and what you agreed to, and what, if anything, you actually felt through all of it." He was quiet for a long moment. Marcus had always processed, slowly. He'd been that way as a child too, needed time to assemble his thoughts before he spoke, which was a quality I'd respected in him when he was young. Now it just felt like watching him decide how much to admit. "It started before Dad died," he said finally. I went very still. Not like that," he added quickly, reading my face. "Not the way it sounds. I just mean Lena had always been practical about money, about assets, about planning. And when Dad got sick that last year, even though it was fast, she started thinking about what came next, what we'd need, what the situation would be. Your father wasn't even in the ground," I said. "I know." He said it like it hurt. "Good. I know that. And at the time I told her to stop. I told her it wasn't the right moment and she backed off. But then he died and he stopped. We had some financial pressure about a year after Dad died. Some bad decisions I made with an investment that Lena had been against from the beginning. And it cost us, not catastrophically, but significantly. And we were already stretched from the house, the mortgage. So you looked at my condo," I said, Lena looked at your condo. I kept my voice level, and you let her. He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. Marcus, I said, I need you to understand something. I am not asking you these questions because I need to punish you. I'm asking because you're my son, and I need to know whether what I'm dealing with is greed or desperation, because those are different problems and they have different, I paused, different implications for what happens next between us. He looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has just realized their mother is not who they thought she was. Not lesser, different, clearer, more solid. Both, he said quietly, honestly, both. Tell me about the Christmas conversation, and I said, what Lena said through the study door. His face changed. The rawness got worse. You heard that. Every word. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not dramatically, just briefly, the gesture of a man who is tired of what he's been carrying. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red at the edges. I should have said something, he said. When she said it, I should have. Yes, I said. You should have. I know. That silence, Marcus, that was the thing, not the plan, not the folders, not Sandra Reeves. The silence. Because if you'd said, Lena, that's not okay. If you'd said, don't talk about my mother that way, we might be having an entirely different conversation right now. But you didn't, and so I understood what I was dealing with. He was quiet for a long time. You're right, he said, and then lower, I'm sorry, Mom. 2 words, 8 letters, entirely insufficient for what had been done, and both of us knew it, but they were real. I could hear that they were real, and I filed that away too. What does Lena think is happening right now? I asked. Something shifted in his face. She thinks I'm coming to talk you out of it. And are you? He met my eyes. No, he said. I don't think so. You don't think so. He stopped, rubbed a hand across his face. No, I'm not. It's done. Right? The contract's signed? Yes. Then there's nothing to talk out of. He said it flatly, and underneath the flatness I heard something that might have been, in a different man, in a different moment, relief. Like someone who'd been holding a plan he'd never fully believed in and had just been given permission to put it down. I watched him for a moment, 65 years old, sitting across from my 41-year-old son, and what I felt was not triumph and not satisfaction, and not even the particular exhausted relief I'd expected. What I felt was sadness, the specific sadness of loving someone who has been smaller than you needed them to be, and of knowing that the distance between who they are and who they could have been is not a gap you can close for them. Lena is going to be furious, I said. Yes, he said simply. That's between you and her, I said. But I need to tell you something, Marcus, and I need you to listen carefully. He looked at me. He was listening. Lena does not get access to my financial situation going forward, not the details of the sale, not the new place, not my accounts, not my retirement, not any of it. If you want a relationship with me, a real one, not the performance we've been doing, it cannot include her having any involvement in my finances. That is not negotiable. A long pause. I watched him absorb it. She's my wife, he said. I know she is. And I'm your mother. And I'm telling you that the version of your marriage that involved the two of you planning around my death while I cooked you dinner is not something I will participate in anymore. He flinched. It was small and quick, but I saw it. So what does that look like? He asked. Practically, it looks like you come to see me because you want to, not because you're managing me. It looks like you ask me how I am and actually listen to the answer. It looks like if Lena has a problem with that arrangement, she keeps it between the two of you. And it looks like you understand that whatever I have, whatever I've built, is mine to do with as I choose. And none of that will change. Marcus looked at the table. He picked up his tea finally and drank. Put it down. Looked at me. I've been a bad son, he said. You've behaved badly, I said. Those are different things. One is permanent and one is correctable. I paused. I don't know yet which one it is for you. I guess we both found out. He left an hour later, quieter than he'd arrived, not resolved. I want to be clear about that because this was not one of those conversations that fixes things. It was a conversation that cracked something open, which is different and actually harder because broken open things have jagged edges and require more careful handling than whole ones. He hugged me at the door. I let him. I did not tell him I loved him in the automatic way I usually did, because I wanted the words to be chosen rather than reflexive, and in that moment I wasn't sure what I had to offer was exactly love. What I had was something more complicated, something that was love's more difficult cousin, honesty mixed with grief, mixed with a very small, fragile hope. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a full minute. Then I went to the kitchen and poured out both cups of cold tea and washed them and put them away. And I picked up the navy notebook and wrote for 20 minutes, putting down everything while it was still vivid. Every word, every silence, every shift in his face. I dated it. I closed the notebook. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I got out my old sketch pad. It was in the closet, in the spare room, under a stack of Richard's old magazines I hadn't gotten around to sorting. A large pad of heavyweight paper, the kind made for charcoal and pastel, and beside it a wooden box of supplies, charcoal sticks, a few pastels, a kneaded eraser that had gone slightly hard from disuse. I'd bought these supplies 6 years ago in a moment of intention that had not survived contact with ordinary life. Richard's illness arriving the following spring, and then grief, and then the long fog. I brought them to the kitchen table. I opened the sketch pad to a fresh page. I didn't know what I was going to draw. I just started moving the charcoal. An hour later, I looked at what I'd made. It wasn't good technically. I was completely out of practice. The proportions were uncertain, the values muddy in places. It was a window. Just a window with late afternoon light coming through it and the vague suggestion of a park outside. My window, my view. It was real and it was mine and I had made it. I sat with that for a long time. The closing happened on a Thursday in early April, 9 days after the conversation with Marcus. I sat in a conference room at the title company and signed my name 15 times and shook hands with Carol Dempsey and with the young couple, the teachers, Tom and Miriam Hale, who were holding hands when they walked in and who thanked me for the condo in a way that was genuine enough to make my throat tighten slightly. And then I walked out of that building into an April morning with a check that represented 22 years of a life and started driving. I did not call Marcus to tell him it was done. I had sent him a brief text 3 days earlier saying the closing date was Thursday, nothing more. He had responded with a single word, okay. I didn't know what the okay meant and I decided not to try to interpret it. I drove to Patricia's office and dropped off a copy of the closing documents for her file. She shook my hand and said, "Well done, Evelyn," in her plain, direct way that meant more than effusiveness would have. I drove to Carol's office and did the same. And then I drove to my new apartment, already technically mine, the keys in my bag since the previous Friday, and I parked in the new parking garage and rode the new elevator to the 4th floor and let myself in. The apartment was empty. My boxes were being moved on Saturday with the help of a moving company I'd hired, and a woman named Ruth Chen, who was Dorothy Farwell's daughter-in-law and who had offered with genuine enthusiasm to come help me unpack. The closing on the new place had gone cleanly, and so for 2 days I existed in a peculiar in-between space, no longer in the old home and not yet settled in the new one. I walked through the empty rooms. My footsteps sounded different in here, cleaner somehow, less weighted. The west light was coming in through the large windows exactly the way it had in the photographs, pooling gold on the bare floor. I stood in the middle of the living room and turned slowly, taking it in. It needed work, not renovation. The finishes were fine, but the kind of inhabiting that turns a space into a home, which takes time and intention and cannot be rushed. I would need to figure out where the light fell at different hours, where I wanted to sit in the morning and where in the evening, what the walls wanted on them. I stood on the small balcony for a long time. The courtyard below was coming into spring, the plantings in the raised beds showing new green, 2 pigeons doing their inefficient business along the railing. I breathed. It was not perfect. I want to say that plainly because I think there is a version of this kind of story that suggests the moment of freedom arrives and everything falls into light and ease, and that was not my experience. My experience was standing on a balcony in an empty apartment on a Thursday morning, 65 years old, a widow with a complicated relationship with my only child and an uncertain road ahead, and feeling, in the middle of all that complexity, something small and stubborn and genuine that I can only describe as the first true quiet I'd felt in years. Not happiness, quiet, which is sometimes more valuable. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work than any I'd done before. Moving on one level is just physical, boxes and furniture and the maddening particularity of reassembling a life in a new space. The lamp that was perfect in the old bedroom looks wrong in the new one. The rug you'd had for 15 years doesn't fit the new hallway. You spend 3 days convinced you've made a terrible mistake about the couch placement, and then move it 1 foot to the left and suddenly everything is right. These are ordinary frustrations, and I had them all. But underneath the ordinary frustrations was something else that I hadn't anticipated, which was the sheer emotional weight of leaving the old place behind. Not the condo, I'd made peace with that, or mostly, but the version of myself who had lived there, the woman who set 2 coffee cups every morning, the woman who cooked careful meals for people who showed up without really seeing her. I was leaving that woman's address, and some part of me grieved her even as another part of me understood that she had to be left. Joyce Moran was invaluable in those weeks. I saw her twice a week and we talked about all of it, the move, Marcus, the closing, the strange emotional texture of the in-between. She had a gift for helping me locate what I was actually feeling, underneath what I thought I was feeling, and more than once I walked out of her office, surprised by my own interior. "You said something interesting last week," she told me in mid-April. "You said you didn't feel triumphant." "I don't," I said. "Can you say more about that?" I thought about it. I expected to feel stronger, maybe, more resolved, like I'd fought something and won, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels more like I stopped, like I've put something down that I was carrying for a very long time, and now my arms don't quite know what to do. Joyce nodded slowly. "That's a very accurate description of major life change," she said. "We often imagine transformation as a moment of arrival. In reality, it's more like stopping a very long walk and not knowing how to stand still." "Yes," I said, "exactly that." "What do you want to do with your arms?" I looked at her. She wasn't being whimsical. It was a genuine question. "Paint," I said, surprising myself with how quickly it came. "I've been drawing again, just charcoal, but I want to paint." She smiled. "Then do that." I bought supplies the following Saturday. Not the hesitant, someday, maybe kind of buying I'd done 6 years ago, but a deliberate, planned-out purchase from an art supply shop downtown that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine and had walls lined with color in a way that made something in my chest feel open and hungry. I spent an hour in the shop and spent more than I'd intended and carried 3 heavy bags to the car and drove home, feeling something that was close, finally, to uncomplicated pleasure. I set up in the second bedroom, the one I designated as my own small studio, the room with the best afternoon light after the living room. I bought a folding table and put my supplies on it and taped a canvas to the wall and stood in front of it with a brush and a palette knife and the particular terror of a blank surface. Then I started. The first painting was bad. I will say that plainly and without embarrassment, because pretending otherwise would be false and also beside the point. It was a painting of the view from my balcony, and it was muddy and the perspective was wrong and the color was unsatisfying. I finished it anyway. I put it in the corner and started the second one. The second one was better, not good. Better. There's a difference, and that difference matters. Somewhere around the 3rd week of April, Dorothy Farwell, knocked on my new door. She was carrying again a casserole dish covered in foil. "I made too much chicken and rice," she said. I stared at her for a moment, and then I laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere real, and stepped back to let her in. "How did you find me, Mum?" I asked, taking the dish. "Carol Dempsey used to sell units in this building," Dorothy said, looking around with the bright-eyed assessment of someone who knows real estate. "I called her." She peered toward the hallway. "Can I see what you've done with the place?" Dorothy stayed for 2 hours and gave me approximately 47 opinions about the furniture arrangement, none of which I fully agreed with, and several of which I implemented the next day without telling her. She met Ruth, who had come to finish helping me hang pictures. She looked at the 2 finished paintings in the studio room and said, "These are actually interesting," which from Dorothy was essentially a rave. She came back the following week with a woman named Pauline Torres, who lived on the 6th floor and was 70 and had short white hair and opinions about everything, and who turned out to be one of the most genuinely funny people I'd encountered in years. The 3 of us drank wine and talked for 3 hours, and when they left, I sat in my living room in the dark for a few minutes. Not out of sadness this time, but out of a kind of stunned gratitude that was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. These were real people in my actual life, not managed, not performed for, just there. I kept painting. I developed a routine, a word that sounds dull, but was actually in those weeks something I was building with real care. The way you'd build anything you want to last. I woke early, made coffee, sat with it by the west window for 30 minutes before I did anything else. I walked every morning a specific route through the neighborhood that I'd mapped out in my first week, and that had already, within a month, become familiar enough that the man at the corner coffee shop knew my order. I painted in the afternoons, usually 2 to 3 hours, in the light that came through the studio window. I had therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I had dinner with Dorothy or Pauline once a week, rotating. I called Marcus on a Sunday in late April. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Mom." His voice was careful, uncertain, in a way he rarely let himself sound. "I'm calling to let you know I'm settled," I said. "The move went well. The new place it's good. I'm good." A pause. "I'm glad." "How are you?" Another pause, longer, something in that pause that told me things at home were not simple. "It's been a complicated few weeks, he said. "I imagine so. Lena is..." He stopped. Started again. "We're working through some things." I didn't ask. I didn't offer. I had learned, was still learning, that there is a version of love that does not rush in to fix, that holds itself back and lets other people do the work of their own lives. "I hope you work through them," I said, and I meant it, not for her sake particularly, for his. "Mom," his voice dropped, Can I come see the new place at some point, when it feels right?" I thought about it honestly, not what I was supposed to feel, what I actually felt. "Yes," I said, "not yet, but yes." "Okay," he said. And again that word carried more than it seemed, a whole conversation in 2 letters, an acknowledgement and a patience I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," and I said, "You too, Mom." We hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment. It wasn't resolved. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because I think the version of this story that would be easiest to tell is one where the confrontation leads to a clean shift, where the admission of wrongdoing opens a door that both people walk through together in the right direction. That's not what happened. What happened was more gradual and less satisfying and considerably more real. There was a crack in something. What grew in that crack, if anything grew at all, would take time and consistency and the kind of honesty that is difficult to sustain. But the crack was there. That was something. May came, and with it a kind of spring that felt more present to me than any in recent memory, possibly because I was more present in it, walking my morning route through a neighborhood that was greening and softening around me, seeing the same faces at the same corners, gradually becoming a familiar feature of a small landscape rather than a ghost in my own life. I joined a painting class at the Community Arts Center 6 blocks from my building. This was Joyce's suggestion, followed up by Dorothy's insistence, and I resisted both of them for 2 weeks before I gave in. The class met on Wednesday evenings in a studio that smelled of acrylic and old wood and had the particular relaxed disorder of a space used regularly by people who are not worried about making a mess. The instructor was a man named Guillermo, maybe 50, compact and precise, and with an eye for what was actually interesting in a painting rather than what was technically correct. He looked at my work in the first session. I'd brought photographs of the pieces I'd done at home and said, "You have a strong sense of light, the rest is just practice." I liked him immediately. The other students ranged in age and ability and were uniformly unconcerned with anyone else's business, which I found enormously restful. There was a woman named Sandra who painted exclusively birds and was extremely serious about it. There was a retired contractor named Bill who was learning to paint because his wife had started and he felt left out. There was a 24-year-old named Kazia who painted large abstract pieces in colors that hurt your eyes in an interesting way, and who, in our third class, looked at my painting in progress and said, "That's genuinely lovely," with the simple directness of someone who says what she means. I paint at home. I painted in class. I painted badly and then slightly less badly. And then on a particular afternoon in mid-May, I finished a piece and stepped back from it and felt for the first time that it was actually good. Not perfect. I'm not sure I'll ever reach perfect, or that I want to, because perfect closes things off in ways that interest me less than open. But good, true to what I'd seen and felt and tried to put down. It was a painting of the old condo. My southeast-facing windows, the morning light as I remembered it, the particular way the shadows fell across the kitchen floor at 8 o'clock on a winter morning. Richard's coffee cup on the counter, visible but not emphasized, the way things that matter most are often visible but not emphasized in real life. I stood in front of it for a long time. It was not a sad painting, or it was sad the way certain true things are sad, not because they lost, but because they were real. I texted Carol Dempsey a photo of it. She responded in about 30 seconds. "Please don't ever sell that one." I had no intention of selling it. I put it in the studio on the wall where I could see it while I worked, not as a monument to what was gone, as a record of what was real, of 22 years that had happened and mattered, and would always have happened and mattered, regardless of what came after them. The end of May brought a phone call from Marcus that was different from the others. He called on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard in years, a quality of being unguarded, not performed in either direction, just plain. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Yes," I said. "Did you and Dad were there times when you weren't happy in the marriage? I mean, I know you were happy. I know it was a good marriage. But were there times when it was just hard?" I sat with that for a moment. It was an unexpected question from an unexpected direction, and it told me something about where he was. "Of course," I said. "Many times." "How did you work through it?" "Sometimes we talked," I said. "Sometimes we didn't talk and just let things settle. Sometimes one of us had to admit we were wrong, which your father was better at than I was. Sometimes things didn't fully resolve. They just became part of the background. The texture of being in a long relationship with another person who is different from you." He was quiet. "Why are you asking?" I said gently. "Lena and I are seeing a therapist," he said, "together." I absorbed that, carefully, without rushing toward a reaction. "That's a brave thing to do," I said. "It's uncomfortable," he said. "Yes, it tends to be." A pause. "Mom?" The therapist asked us each to think about the people in our lives we treated unfairly, and he stopped. I kept coming back to you. I sat very still. I know I already apologized, he said, and I know that probably wasn't enough. But I wanted to say it again, differently, not a generic sorry. I want you to know that I understand specifically what I did. I let Lena make you into a problem to be solved instead of a person, and I didn't stop it. I watched it happen, and I told myself it was practical, and I didn't stop it. I listened, and I think I did it, he said, and now his voice was very quiet, the voice I associated with the moments in his life when he was being completely honest, which had been rare and therefore memorable, because I was scared, not of losing the money, of losing you, of watching you get older and not knowing how to handle it. And instead of telling you that, instead of just saying, Mom, I'm terrified of losing you the way we lost Dad, I turned it into a plan. I turned grief into logistics. And I made you pay for it. The silence between us was different from every other silence in our conversations this past year. This one had air in it. I pressed the phone against my ear and looked at the painting on my studio wall. The old kitchen, the morning light, Richard's coffee cup visible but not emphasized. Marcus, I said, yeah, that's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years. A long pause. I know. It doesn't fix everything, I said. I know that too. But it's something. It's the beginning of something if you want it to be. I want it to be it, he said, quiet and certain. Okay, I said. Then let's see. After we hung up, I sat in my living room in the fading light of a May evening in my new apartment, 65 years old, with my painting on the wall and my navy notebook on the table and the sounds of the building around me. Distant music from upstairs, the elevator, a door closing somewhere, the ordinary human noise of a building full of people living their lives. And I thought about what it meant to not be invisible. It didn't mean everything was repaired. It didn't mean the damage was undone or the year of careful manipulation and patient waiting had been erased. It didn't mean Lena had changed or that Marcus was, suddenly and completely, the man I'd needed him to be. It didn't mean I would stop being vigilant or that I'd put the navy notebook away or that I'd ever again be the woman who set 2 coffee cups and cooked careful meals to keep people who didn't love her well from leaving. What it meant was this: I had my name on a deed I had chosen. I had money in accounts that were mine. I had a studio with paint on the walls and a painting that was actually good. I had Dorothy and Pauline and Guillermo and Kazia and Dr. Joyce Moran on Tuesday and Thursday, and a coffee shop where they knew my order. I had improbably and incompletely and more painfully than I would have liked, reclaimed myself. Not the self that had existed before Richard died. That woman was gone, and the grief of her was real, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But a new version, a woman who had learned at 65 the particular difficult freedom of deciding that her own life was worth fighting for, not dramatically, not with a speech, but in the quiet and deliberate way of someone who goes to an attorney on a Friday morning and says, I'm ready, and then goes home and makes soup. Outside my window, the May evening was going slowly golden, pigeons on the balcony railing, the courtyard below, green and unhurried. I got up and stood at the window and looked out at none of it in particular, just the ordinary evening beauty of a world that kept going, and I thought, I am still here. I am still, after everything, here. End of part 4. Summer came to my new neighborhood the way summer comes to places that have real trees. Gradually, then all at once, the green deepening by increments until one morning you look out the window and realize the world has gone full and lush, and the light is different, softer and more golden in the mornings, and you've been living inside a new season without quite noticing the transition. I noticed it on a Tuesday in early June, standing on my balcony with my first cup of coffee, watching the courtyard below, where 2 residents I recognized, but didn't yet know by name, were walking a large, unhurried dog through the plantings. The dog stopped to investigate something in the raised bed. The man at the other end of the leash waited with complete patience. The woman beside him said something I couldn't hear, and he laughed. I stood there watching them for longer than made sense and felt something I can only describe as a quiet fullness. Not happiness exactly, because happiness is a specific thing and tends not to last at sustained levels, but something more structural than happiness, something underneath it, a foundation. I had been in the new apartment for 6 weeks. I had learned which floorboards creaked near the bathroom door, and that the elevator on the north end of the building was 30 seconds faster than the one by the mailboxes, and that my neighbor across the hall, a man named Frank Okafor, who was 68 and recently retired from 30 years of teaching high school history, made bread on Sunday mornings, and that the smell of it drifted into the hallway in a way that did something genuinely good to a person. Frank had knocked on my door the second week with a loaf wrapped in a clean dish towel. "Housewarming, sir," he said. "Sorry it's late. I kept meaning to come over and then not doing it." I told him it was the best housewarming gift I'd ever received, and I meant it completely. He had become, in the week since, something between a neighbor and a friend, the easy, undemanding kind of friendship that forms between two people who live near each other and share a certain quality of attention to the ordinary world. We talked in the hallway. We had coffee once in the courtyard. He told me about his 30 years of teaching with the mixture of exhaustion and deep love that marks people who chose the right work. I told him a little about painting, about the class, about Guillermo's comment that I had a strong sense of light and that the rest was practice. "Is he right?" Frank asked. "About which part?" "Both." I thought about it honestly. "I think so," I said, "about both." These were the textures of my new life, small and real, and nothing like what I'd had before, and I was learning, still learning. It was a continuous process to let that be enough. Not a consolation prize, not a smaller version of a bigger life. Just what was actually here in front of me, which turned out to be more than I'd let myself want for a long time. The painting class had become the anchor of my week in a way I hadn't anticipated. Wednesday evenings in Guillermo's studio had taken on the quality of something I protected in my schedule, which meant something, because for most of the previous 4 years I'd had no schedule worth protecting. I was working on a series now, not intentionally. It had emerged organically over 3 or 4 sessions of domestic interiors, rooms, windows, the quality of light in specific spaces at specific hours. Guillermo had looked at the 4 pieces I'd completed and said, with the directness I'd come to appreciate, "There's a story in these. Keep following it." Kezia, the 24-year-old with the bold abstract work, had started sometimes staying after class to talk. Not about painting, mostly. About life in the wandering, exploratory way that young people do when they're trying to map a world that keeps changing shape. I found, to my own surprise, that I had things to say, not advice exactly, more like observations from a longer vantage point, offered without the expectation that they'd be taken. One evening she said out of nowhere, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," I said. "Were you always this, I don't know how to say it, this settled? Like in yourself? Or is that something that happened?" I looked at her for a moment. She was genuinely curious, not flattering me. "It happened," I said, "and not very long ago, and it cost more than I expected." She nodded slowly. I think about that sometimes. Whether people are born knowing who they are, or whether you have to go through something to find it. "Both, I think," I said. "But the going through something part is not optional. I've never met a person who found themselves in comfortable circumstances." She was quiet for a moment, then, "What did you go through?" I smiled. "That's a very long story. I have time." "Maybe someday," I said, "when I've figured out how to tell it." It occurred to me, driving home that evening, that I was already telling it. In what you're reading now. That the act of putting it into words, of going back through it from October to this June morning, with the dog in the courtyard, was its own kind of making sense of things, its own kind of art maybe. Though I'm no writer and I know it, what I know is that stories matter. That the act of saying this happened, and this happened because of that, and I felt this and chose that, that act is not passive. It's a way of insisting on your own reality, of saying, "I was here, I was a person. What happened to me was real, and I'm not ashamed of it, and I'm not going to be quiet about it. I had been quiet for too long. We're done with that now. June moved forward, and so did I. And then on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of the month, Marcus came to see the new apartment. He had called the week before and asked carefully whether the offer still stood. I said yes. We agreed on Saturday morning at 10. He arrived, alone. I noticed, the same as the day in March when things cracked open, carrying coffee from the shop on my corner, 2 cups, which meant he'd done his homework about the neighborhood, looked it up, found the coffee shop, thought to bring some. It was a small thing, and I noticed it the way you notice small things when you've spent a long time watching for them. I let him in. He walked through the apartment the way people do when they're trying to see something honestly rather than just looking at it. Slowly, actually attending. He stood at the west-facing windows for a moment and looked at the view. He saw the studio. I'd left the door open and stopped in the doorway. The paintings were on the walls now, 6 of them. The interior series plus 2 others, the view from the balcony that I'd repainted 3 times before I was satisfied, and a newer piece I'd finished just that week that I hadn't shown anyone yet, not even Guillermo. Marcus stood in the doorway of the studio and looked at them for a long time. "Mom, he said finally. I know they're not technically perfect," I said from behind him. "That's not what I was going to say." I waited. "They're beautiful," he said, quietly and without performance. "That one." He pointed to the painting of the old kitchen, Richard's coffee cup, the morning light, the winter shadows on the floor. "Is that our old place?" "Yes." He looked at it for another long moment. "It makes me miss Dad," he said. "Me too," I said. We stood there together for a moment, my son and I, in the doorway of a studio in a home he'd never been in before, looking at a painting of the home we'd both lost. Him to memory, me to deliberate choice, and missing the same man from our different distances. It was the most connected I'd felt to Marcus in years. And it happened in front of a painting, not in a conversation, which seemed about right. We had coffee at my kitchen table. He looked around the apartment with something I could only read as genuine interest. Not inventory, not assessment, just looking the way you look at a place when you're trying to understand the person who lives there. "You seem good," he said. "I am good," I said. "Better than I've been in a long time." "I can see that." He looked at his coffee cup. "It makes me—" He stopped. "What?" "Relieved," he said, "and ashamed at the same time." He said it plainly, without asking for reassurance, which told me the therapy was doing something. "Both of those are appropriate," I said. He laughed once, briefly. "You've gotten more direct." "I've always been direct," and I said. "I just stopped showing it." "Fair." He turned the cup in his hands. "Mom, I want to tell you something about Lena, not to make excuses. Just because I think you should know the full picture. Go ahead." "She grew up without money," he said, "really without it. Her family lost their house when she was 11. She's never felt safe about it, about having enough. And when we had that financial hit a couple years ago, it triggered something in her that he paused. She didn't handle well. She went into a kind of survival mode that I should have pushed back on earlier than I did. I listened. "That's not an excuse, he said again. "I know," I said. "It's context. Context matters. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes how I understand it. She's working on it in therapy. She asked me to—" He stopped again, seemed to be weighing something. "She asked me to tell you she's sorry. She wanted to tell you herself, but she didn't think you'd take the call." I considered that. Lena, asking Marcus to carry an apology she didn't have the courage to deliver directly. It was honest in its way. Honest about her limitations, which was more than she'd shown me in 9 years of marriage to my son. It wasn't enough. It was, however, something. "Tell her I heard it," I said, "and that we'll see." Marcus nodded. He understood what we'll see meant coming from me now, not a dismissal and not a welcome. A door that was neither open nor fully closed, which was the most accurate thing I could offer. We talked for 2 more hours. Really talked. The kind of conversation we hadn't had in years, maybe ever, where both people are actually present and actually honest and not managing each other toward a desired outcome. He told me things about his marriage that were hard and real. I told him things about the past year, the Navy notebook, the meetings with Patricia, the nights when I'd almost talked myself back into small and frightened, that I hadn't told anyone except Joyce. At one point he said, "Did you ever think about just confronting us earlier, before all the planning?" "Yes," I said, and every time I thought about it, I realized I wouldn't have been ready. I would have cried or backed down or believed you when you said it wasn't what it looked like. I needed to be far enough along, legally, emotionally, before the conversation could happen without me losing it. He was quiet. You knew yourself well enough to know that. Eventually, I said, it took a while. I didn't know you were that strategic, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite admiration but lived in that neighborhood. I didn't know it either, I said. I think I had to become it. He left at noon. At the door he hugged me. A real hug, not the quick, dutiful version, the kind that takes a moment and means it. And I let myself receive it without pulling away early, which was something I'd been working on, receiving things, not deflecting care as a reflex. "Same time next month?" he asked. "Call me first," I said. "But yes, probably." He nodded. He left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway and took stock of what I felt the way Joyce had taught me. Just check in, just notice, don't rush to name it as good or bad. What I felt was cautiously open, like a window cracked in early spring, not flung wide but not shut either, letting in a small precise amount of something new. I could work with cautiously open. I could work with that. July brought the exhibition, and I need to tell you about the exhibition because it matters to the story in a way that goes beyond the fact of it. Guillermo ran a small show every summer for his students in the studio itself, which got rearranged for the occasion and opened one Friday evening to friends and family and whoever else wandered in off the street. It was not prestigious. It was not reviewed in any publication. It was a room full of paintings made by ordinary people who had given their Wednesday evenings to the difficult and humbling work of trying to see something clearly and put it down honestly. He asked me in late June if I wanted to show 4 pieces. I said yes before I had time to second-guess myself, which Joyce would have been proud of. I spent the first 2 weeks of July framing them. Not expensive frames, I couldn't justify that and didn't want to, but simple, clean ones that I painted myself in a warm white that complemented the work. Dorothy came over and helped me decide which 4. She was surprisingly good at it, with the same decisive quality she brought to furniture arrangement and casserole delivery and everything else she put her mind to. "This one," she said, standing in front of the old kitchen painting. "Absolutely this one." I wasn't sure if it was too personal, I said. "It's exactly personal enough," she said. "That's the point." We chose the balcony view, the old kitchen, a painting of my new studio in morning light that I'd done in late June, and that had come out better than expected, and a newer one. The piece I'd finished the week Marcus visited that I still hadn't shown Guillermo. It was a painting of a door, just a door, partway open, with warm light visible through the gap. Simple subject, something that had been sitting in me for a while before it found its way onto canvas. "What do you call it?" Dorothy asked, standing in front of the door painting. I hadn't given it a title. I thought about it for a moment. "Cautiously open," I said. She looked at me. "That's perfect," she said. The evening of the show was a Friday in late July, warm and clear, the kind of summer evening that seems designed to make people feel like their lives are larger than usual. Guillermo had strung lights in the studio and put out wine and cheese, and the paintings were hung with enough space between them that each one had room to breathe. Dorothy came, obviously. Pauline came in a bright orange dress that made an announcement and brought a woman from her building who turned out to be a retired art teacher and who stood in front of my old kitchen painting for 3 full minutes. Frank Okafor came, carrying a notebook because he took things seriously. Kezia came and brought 2 of her friends who knew nothing about the show but were in the neighborhood and wandered in as Guillermo had hoped people would. Marcus came. I hadn't told him about it. I'd mentioned in passing during our July phone call that there was a student show at the art center I attended, and he had asked when, and I had told him, and he had not confirmed or declined. So I had not expected him. I was standing near the wine table, talking to the retired art teacher whose name was Vera, and who had very specific opinions about underpainting. When I looked up and saw him in the doorway, he was alone. No Lena. I registered that with a neutrality I'd earned, neither relief nor disappointment, just noting it. He was wearing a blue shirt, and he looked nervous in the small specific way of someone who has made a deliberate decision and is not sure of its reception. I caught his eye and nodded. He crossed the room toward me. "You didn't tell me you were actually showing work," he said when he reached me. "I told you there was a show. I thought it was I didn't know it was your work on the walls." He looked around the room. He found the painting of the old kitchen almost immediately. It had the kind of quality that pulled the eye, even across a room, even among other work. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at me. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you could do this?" "Because I didn't know," I said simply. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in something more like wonder, and I thought about that boy who had jumped in puddles and cried over Chester and held my hand in the hospital, and I thought about the man who had stood in a study doorway and said nothing while his wife calculated my remaining years, and I held both of those people in my mind simultaneously and understood, maybe for the first time completely, that they were the same person, that people are not one thing, that the capacity for real harm and the capacity for real love often live in the same person, and the question is not which one is real, but which one gets fed. Marcus had been feeding the wrong one for years. He was trying, imperfectly and with significant room for failure, to change that. I would not pretend that was enough, but I would not pretend it was nothing. "Come look at this one, I said, and led him across the room to the door painting, cautiously open. He stood in front of it and looked at it, and I watched his face. "What is it?" he asked, not dismissively, genuinely uncertain what he was seeing. "A door, I said. "I can see it's a door." A pause. "What does it mean?" I thought about how to say it. "It means that things can be closed and then not entirely closed. That there's a version of open that isn't the same as wide open, that sometimes the light comes through a gap, and that's enough." He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at me. "Is that—" He stopped, started again. "Is that us, this painting?" "Among other things," I said. He was quiet. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was keeping something contained. "I want to buy it," he said. "It's not for sale, so—" "Mom, none of them are for sale, yeah," I said. "Not tonight, maybe not ever. These aren't product markers. These are what I made when I was figuring out who I was." He looked at me, and in his expression, this 41-year-old man who had inherited his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness and had done both of them proud and both of them wrong in the course of his life, I saw something I hadn't seen from him in a very long time. Respect. Not the perform kind, not the kind someone offers because they want something. The real kind. The kind that's slightly uncomfortable to give because it requires acknowledging that the person in front of you is larger than your previous version of them. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, Mom." We stood there together in the middle of the room while the evening moved around us. Pauline's orange dress, Dorothy talking to Guillermo with the focused intensity of someone who has opinions she intends to share, Frank taking careful notes in his notebook, Kezia and her friends arguing gently about something near the door, the warm summer light coming through the studio windows and landing on paintings made by ordinary people who had been brave enough to try. I want to tell you what I learned, not as a tidy lesson wrapped in a bow. I don't trust those. And after everything I've been through, I have no patience for the version of the story that ends with everything sorted and healed and everyone on good terms. Life is not like that. People are not like that. What I went through was real, and the damage was real, and the repair, where it's happening at all, is happening slowly and unevenly and with no guarantee. But here is what I know. I know that you can love someone and still be harmed by them. That love does not make people safe. That the people who can hurt you most deeply are usually the ones you've given the most access to yourself. And that recognizing this, really recognizing it, not as an idea, but as a lived fact, is one of the hardest things a person can do, especially when that person is a mother and the someone is her child. I know that waiting, the particular kind of waiting I'd been doing, deferring my own life in the hope that people would finally see me clearly, is not love. It's fear. And fear makes you small. And small is not safe. Small just feels safe. Small is actually very dangerous, because a woman who has made herself invisible cannot protect herself from people who prefer her that way. I know that legal documents and careful planning and a navy notebook full of dated records are not unromantic or mercenary or cold. They are the tools of a woman who understood that good intentions are no substitute for protected rights. Richard used to say that hope is not a strategy. He was right about that, as he was right about most things. I know that rebuilding a life, a relationship, yourself, is not a moment of arrival. It's a practice. It's the painting class on Wednesday evenings, and the morning walk, and the coffee at the west window, and the willingness to start over with a new canvas when the last one didn't work. It's Frank's bread in the hallway, and Dorothy's casserole, and Pauline's orange dress, and Kezia asking serious questions, and Joyce listening on Tuesday and Thursday with that particular quality of attention that makes you feel your own experience is worth the time. I know that a mother has the right to protect herself. I know that sentence sounds obvious, and I know that for many women of my generation, women who were taught that their value lived entirely in what they gave to others, it is not obvious at all. It is, in fact, radical. The idea that a 65-year-old widow is entitled to her own financial security, her own home of her choosing, her own life lived on her own terms, without having to justify any of it to the people she loves. That idea should not require courage to hold. And yet it did, and I held it anyway. And I know this, which is the hardest thing and the truest thing and the thing I most want to say. The person I needed to reclaim myself from was not only Marcus, it was not only Lena, it was also the version of me that had decided, somewhere in the fog of grief, that she had no right to take up space. That version had to be found and argued with and ultimately replaced by someone more willing to be inconvenient, more willing to be seen, more willing to say, no, this is mine and I will not give it away. That argument was the real one. The one with my son was almost secondary. The one with myself was the whole war. 3 weeks after the exhibition, on a hot August afternoon, I was in my studio working on a new piece. I'd been painting light on water, working from photographs I'd taken at a lake, an hour from the city where Dorothy had driven a group of us for a day trip the previous weekend, when my phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a text from Marcus. 4 words, she wants to call. I set down my brush. I read the message twice. I picked the brush up again, put it down again. Lena wanted to call. I sat with that for a long time, longer than the situation probably required. I turned it over, examined it from all angles, tried to locate what I actually felt rather than what I thought I should feel. What I felt was weary, tired, and underneath the tiredness, something small and stubborn that I recognized as the same quality that had made me call Patricia Henley in the first place. The part that wasn't done, the part that was willing to keep going. I typed back, give me a week. His response came quickly, okay. I put the phone down and picked up my brush and went back to painting light on water. The thing about light on water is that it never holds still. It's constantly shifting, constantly remaking itself. And you can't paint it the way you'd paint a rock or a chair, because by the time you've mixed the color, it's already changed. You have to learn to suggest it, to capture the quality of the movement rather than the movement itself. I thought about that for a while, about the difference between capturing a thing and suggesting it, about how the most alive paintings I'd seen in museums, in galleries, on Guillermo's studio walls were never the ones that nailed everything down. They were the ones that left some space, some suggestion, some room for the person looking to bring themselves into it. A week later, I answered Lena's call. She spoke first, which surprised me. I'd expected her to make me open the door. But she spoke, her voice careful and stripped of its usual smooth management, and what she said was this: "Evelyn, I am not good at this. I'm not going to pretend I am. But I behaved badly toward you for a long time, and I called it practical. And it wasn't. It was selfish, and it was wrong, and I'm sorry." No framing, no context offered, no mention of her difficult childhood, which I knew Marcus had shared with me in April, and which she could have used but didn't. Just, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I sat with it. "I hear you," I said. "I don't expect anything from that," she said. "I just needed to say it. Marcus said you're doing well and that you're painting, and I just..." A pause. "I'm glad you're doing well." Was that true? Did she mean it? I honestly didn't know. I wasn't sure she knew either. People in the early stages of genuine change are often uncertain about their own sincerity. They're saying the right things and trying to locate whether they mean them, and sometimes the meaning catches up to the words later, and sometimes it doesn't. I wasn't going to decide for her which kind this was. "Thank you for calling," I said. "That took something." "Yeah," she said, "just that, Lena." I paused, choosing words carefully. We are not starting over. I don't believe in erasing things that happened, but I'm also not interested in holding this over you indefinitely. So what I'm offering is a beginning, something small, and we'll see what it grows into. A silence. "Okay," she said, the same word Marcus had used, the word that seemed to be the honest answer when there was nothing more complicated to say. "Okay," I said. We talked for 11 more minutes about nothing in particular. The summer, a restaurant Marcus had liked, something about a trip they were considering. Ordinary conversation, the kind that doesn't mean much on its own but means everything as a practice, as a signal that two people are willing to try the ordinary. When I hung up, I sat in my studio with the unfinished water painting in front of me, and the late afternoon light coming through the west window at the particular angle it came at this hour, golden and slanted and a little heavy with the end of the day. I was not happy in a simple way. I want to be honest about that because I've been honest about everything else. I was complicated. I was still grieving things. Richard, the version of my son I'd thought I had, the years I'd spent invisible. I still had moments, not often, but real, when I woke up at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark with the full weight of everything that had happened pressing down. But I was here, more here than I'd been in years, more present in my own life. The painting in front of me was light on water, shifting, never quite holding still. I picked up my brush. I worked for another hour until the light changed and made it impossible to judge the color correctly, and then I cleaned my brushes and stood back and looked at what I had. It wasn't finished, but it was genuinely good, and I knew the difference now between those two things in a way I hadn't 6 months ago. I thought about the yellow legal pad in January, the word I'd crossed out and replaced. Afraid. Done. I thought about Patricia's office and the Navy notebook and Carol Dempsey saying you're in a strong position, and Tom and Miriam Hale holding hands at the closing, and Joyce Moran asking me when I stopped thinking my own needs were valid. I thought about the woman who used to lie still in the dark before opening her eyes, remembering who she was, who she had become. I thought about Richard, about how much of what I'd done this year he would have recognized in me, not the strategy or the planning, but the underneath of it. The part that said, I am worth fighting for. He had known that about me before I did. He used to say, early in our marriage when I was still learning to take up space in the world, "Evelyn, you don't have to earn everything. Some things you're just allowed to have." I had not fully believed him then. I believed him now. In October, 1 year almost exactly. From the Sunday, I'd stood at my window watching Marcus's car leave the parking lot and felt the first tremor of something changing. I went to a small gallery downtown with Guillermo and 3 other students from the Wednesday class, including Kezia and Sandra, who paints birds, to see a show of contemporary paintings that Guillermo thought we should see. The show was good, more than good. It was the kind of work that makes you feel simultaneously humbled and galvanized, that raises the bar of what you understand to be possible. We spent 2 hours moving through it, and afterward we stood on the sidewalk in the October evening, all 5 of us, and talked about what we'd seen with the particular intensity of people who are genuinely moved and trying to process it. Walking to my car afterward, alone for a moment, I stopped on the sidewalk and looked up. October sky, that particular deep blue-black that only shows up on clear fall evenings when the temperature has just dropped enough. Stars were visible despite the city light. The trees along the street were just beginning to turn. 1 year ago, I had stood in my old hallway with ice water where my hand should have been, listening to my son's wife say she can't last much longer. And I had gone to the powder room and dried my hands on a monogrammed towel and looked at myself in the mirror and felt something shift. Here I was, still shifting, still becoming. The woman who had looked back at me from that mirror would not have predicted this October, would not have predicted the studio or the Wednesday evenings or Frank's bread in the hallway or Dorothy's casseroles or any of it, would not have predicted a painting of a door called Cautiously Open, hanging in a student show, with her son standing in front of it, learning to see her differently. She would not have predicted that she would survive it and come out the other side, not smaller but larger, not diminished but expanded, not finished but finally, truly, deeply begun. I got in my car. I turned on the heat against the October chill. I drove home through streets that were becoming familiar, past the coffee shop where they knew my order, past the entrance to my building, where Frank would probably be awake on the other side of the hall, and where the smell of Sunday bread had not yet faded completely from the corridor. I parked. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. I unlocked my door. Inside, my apartment was quiet and warm and fully mine. My paintings were on the walls. Richard's desk was in the studio. The kettle was on the counter, and there was a canvas on the easel that I'd been working on all week. A new piece, something I was still finding my way into, which felt right. Still finding my way into it, still discovering what it needed to become. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I did not set 2 cups. 1 cup. Mine. Enough. Outside the west windows, October was doing what October does, making everything vivid and temporary and more beautiful for being temporary. The leaves catching the last of the light before they fell. I sat with my tea and watched it and breathed. I had not lost my family. What I had lost was the false version of it, the version where I disappeared into servitude and called that love. What I had now was harder and realer and built on something that could hold weight, honesty, even when it cost something, boundaries, even when they hurt, respect, even when it had to be demanded rather than given. I had not arrived anywhere perfect. I want to say that clearly and finally. This is not a story about a woman who fixed everything and lived easily ever after. This is a story about a woman who stopped being afraid in the middle of the night, who got up in the morning and made a phone call, who kept notes in a Navy notebook and trusted the right people and let the wrong people show themselves clearly and then acted on what she saw. This is a story about choosing yourself, not once, not in a single dramatic moment, but over and over, in every small daily act of showing up for your own life, in every painting, in every conversation you have without shrinking, in every morning you open your eyes and remember who you are and decide to be her anyway. That is not a small thing. In fact, I have come to believe it is the only thing. Tracy. End. You're almost out of usage. Resets at 7 a.m.